They wore crowns, commanded empires, and shaped history, but behind palace walls their children trembled, seized, wept, wandered. Some were hidden, some were crowned, some were quietly erased. This is not the story of kings and queens who ruled, it's the story of those they couldn't control. 33 rulers across centuries, continents, and dynasties, all bound by one haunting thread, a child who didn't fit the script. In a world where bloodlines meant destiny, what happened when that blood came flawed? Welcome to 33 kings and queens who had disabled children, a history of power, denial, and the quiet collapse behind the throne. Before we dive in, make sure you subscribe to the channel if stories like this keep you up at night. We drop long-form mysteries twice a month, no ads, no mercy. And hey, where in the world are you watching from? Drop your country and the exact time in the comments. Let's see who's listening in the darkest hour. 1. King George V, UK, and Prince John. There are many ways to be invisible in a palace. Prince John found all of them. He was the youngest child of King George V and Queen Mary, a boy born into the gilded stillness of Edwardian royalty, where smiles were rehearsed and silence was hereditary. He arrived in 1905, long after the public had tired of royal births, and long before they would ever learn the boy's name in full. From the beginning, his world was split in two, upstairs, where history watched, and downstairs, where his seizures began. By all accounts, Prince John was a cheerful, affectionate child, lively, sometimes too lively, they said, a boy with a laugh too loud for photographs and a gait too wild for portraits. The first signs were subtle. He was not quite like the others. Then the seizures started, then the fits. Then, as modern historians would suggest, signs of what we now understand as autism began to shape his behavior, his need for routine, his struggle with crowds, his intense sensory focus. But the 1910s had no patience for neurology. The world had war, the monarchy had image control, and John had a nurse. He was 7 when the royal family started to remove him from view. Not formally, just little by little. A cancelled appearance here, a missed photo there, fewer family portraits, fewer questions. Officially, he was simply unwell, unfit for duty perhaps, unfit for visibility certainly. So they moved him, first to Sandringham, then to a smaller estate called Wood Farm on the edge of the royal grounds, far from the marble, mirrors and mouths of the court. Wood Farm is still there, quiet, remote, beautiful in that lonely English way. That's where John spent most of his short life, watched over by his nurse Lala and visited occasionally by his mother, who by some accounts adored him and by others merely tolerated him. The truth is likely something more unsettling. She did both. Royal affection, after all, was a performance bound in corsets and protocol. Even love had a dress code. At Wood Farm, John played in the gardens, collected animals, built model railways, and sometimes greeted guests with an anxious burst of joy. There are stories of his vivid memory and natural mimicry. He would mimic the voices of guests so well it startled them. Then the seizure would come and he would fall, sometimes silent, sometimes screaming, and then the garden would go quiet again. He was 10, then 11, then 12, and the seizures got worse. They called it epilepsy. They didn't yet call it neurological variance. They didn't call it autism spectrum disorder. They didn't call it neurodivergence. They called it difficult, and difficult children, like difficult truths, were best kept in the countryside. In January 1919, just as the First World War was finally being disassembled, piece by broken piece, Prince John suffered a massive seizure. It was early morning. His nurse found him unresponsive. The family was summoned, but slowly, too slowly. His mother did not arrive before the boy was gone. He was just 13. His death was marked in the papers with a quiet dignity, softened by euphemism. A long illness, a tragic loss. No details, no public funeral, no shared grief, just a footnote in the royal timeline. another child lost to history, though not quite, because history, for all its amnesia, remembers the inconvenient in whispers. What's more revealing than John's brief life is the story that the royal family chose not to tell. His mother mourned him in private, referring to him afterward as a dear little boy too different to survive. His father, George V, once said that John had been more of an animal than anything else. That's the kind of sentence that should be carved in glass and hung over every royal crest, a reminder that lineage does not guarantee humanity. What do you do when a child doesn't fit the script? You edit the script, you turn the page, you hope no one goes back and reads it again, but history does, and it's been reading closely. The irony, of course, is that the House of Windsor would come to be defined not by its perfection, but by its fractures, broken marriages, addictions, scandals, exiles. Invisibility, it turns out, was contagious. The monarchy had made a career out of presenting itself as strong, unified, noble, while quietly discarding those who didn't fit the brand. Prince John was merely the first of many to be buried under the royal rug, and the cost of all that silence, still unpaid. But if you walk through the gardens at Sandringham today, you might pass by Wood Farm, now rented to distant cousins or retired staff. You might not even know what happened there. That's how well the invisibility worked until now. Because the next boy on our list had a different fate. He wasn't hidden away. He was placed on a pedestal. He was the heir to the Russian Empire, wrapped in velvet, baptized in gold, and cursed with the one thing power couldn't stop: bleeding. 2. Tsar Nicholas II, Russia, and Tsarevich Alexei the Romanovs had everything: palaces, armies, icons soaked in gold leaf and incense. But what they did not have in the end was a way to stop the bleeding. Tsarevich Alexei Nikolaevich was born in 1904 to Tsar Nicholas II and Empress Alexandra Fyodorovna, after 4 daughters and decades of pressure. He was the long-prayed-for male heir, the future of the Russian autocracy, the final piece in a dynasty that had ruled for over 300 years. And from the outside, he appeared perfect. Glowing cheeks, piercing blue eyes, born at dawn, hailed as a miracle. But from within, deep within, where blood moves like secrets, the truth was already forming. He had haemophilia. It wasn't diagnosed immediately because haemophilia never is. It waits for the smallest scratch, a bruise, a bump on a baby's leg. Then it lingers. Then it spreads. For Alexei, it started early. One minor fall and his thigh swelled to twice its size. His joints locked up. He screamed, but not just from pain, from fear. He could feel something wrong, something off, but couldn't name it. His mother could, so could her family. The gene came through her, passed down from Queen Victoria of England, making Alexei one of several royal boys across Europe afflicted by the same cruel irony. Bloodlines that couldn't stop bleeding. The Russian court panicked, not publicly, of course. Publicly, they offered reassurance. The heir was strong, healthy, blessed. But behind the throne, inside the opulent isolation of imperial palaces, every bump became a national crisis. Every stumble could mean death. And so the family built a life around silence, around caution, around lies. Alexei was watched constantly. No jumping, no riding, no roughhousing. He lived under a sort of golden house arrest, surrounded by doctors, bodyguards, and layers of superstition. His mother, Empress Alexandra, grew increasingly anxious. Some said obsessed. Others said cursed. She searched for remedies that science couldn't give her, and in her desperation, she let a man into the palace who would change the course of history, not just for Alexei, but for the Romanovs and for Russia itself. Grigory Rasputin. He was a mystic, a healer, a political grenade wrapped in spiritual charisma, and Alexandra believed he could ease her son's suffering. Whether through hypnosis, prayer, or pure coincidence, Rasputin's presence did seem to calm Alexei's worst episodes, and that was enough. Alexandra entrusted him with more than access. She gave him influence over the household, over the government, over the Tsar himself. Rasputin was allowed to stay because Alexei continued to live. But Rasputin was a scandal magnet. His presence corrupted what little was left of the royal family's reputation. To the Russian public, already starving, angry, radicalized, he was proof that the Romanovs were detached, delusional, and dangerous. A peasant puppet master pulling strings in a crumbling palace. Meanwhile, Alexei continued to suffer. He had good days, of course. He loved boats, dogs, military uniforms, and mimicry. Like Prince John in England, he had a sharp memory and a wild sense of humour. His sisters doted on him. His father tried, but Nicholas was more Tsar than Dad, dutiful, distant, and overwhelmed. Most of the time, Alexei's world shrank to a single room. In 1912, a particularly horrifying episode left him close to death for weeks. He'd fallen in a boat and begun bleeding internally. The doctors could do nothing. The court prepared for mourning. Alexandra wrote goodbye letters. And then Rasputin, from hundreds of miles away, sent a telegram. God has seen your tears. Do not grieve. The little one will not die. He didn't. He recovered, and that single event cemented Rasputin's hold on the royal family, possibly more than any law, prayer, or tradition ever could. The monarchy had gambled its future on a spiritual savior because medicine had failed its only heir. And what do you do with a boy who cannot bleed safely in a nation about to spill all its blood? You hide him, you protect him, you pray for him, but nothing, not velvet, not divinity, not Rasputin, could save the Romanovs from the revolution already stalking their gates. In 1917, the empire collapsed. The family was imprisoned, and still they tried to protect Alexei, sheltering him, nursing him, distracting him. He didn't understand the full scale of what was happening. Or maybe he did, but chose to remain a child a little longer. He still smiled, still made jokes, still believed in the quiet moments that they would all be okay. He had no idea the royal line would end with him. But he wasn't alone in this tragic lineage of imperial expectations. Across the channel, his great-grandmother Queen Victoria had already buried her own disabled son decades earlier, another prince whose blood would not clot, whose seizures came without warning, and whose name was almost lost to time. Almost. 2 stories in, and we've already seen how royalty handles what it can't fix, with silence, exile, or a carefully staged smile. If you're still here, you're one of us. Subscribe for more long-form dives like this one, deep, strange, and uncomfortably real. And while you're at it, tell us, where are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Midnight in Manila? 3 a.m. in Ohio? We want to know who's still awake, and why. 3. Queen Victoria, UK, and Prince Leopold. Queen Victoria gave birth to 9 children. She ruled over a quarter of the planet, lived through assassination attempts, and kept a daily journal for over 70 years. But when her 8th child, Prince Leopold, was born in 1853, something finally happened that neither crown, nor constitution, nor calendar could control. Her child came into the world with a body that wouldn't listen. Leopold was the first known case of haemophilia in the British royal family, though at the time the word meant little to most physicians. His bleeding wasn't visible at birth, but it waited like a shadow in his bloodstream. When it showed itself, it came in bruises that didn't fade, joints that swelled without reason, and the quiet dread of every parent who watches a child fall and knows it could be fatal. Victoria, ever the self-styled empress of logic and restraint, was shattered. She blamed herself. She called it a curse, perhaps a moral one, perhaps divine. And in a way it was. Haemophilia was passed from mother to son, recessive and silent. The gene that would cripple the Russian Empire and stalk the halls of Spanish and German courts had started here with her. The royal disease, they called it later. But in the beginning, it was just something that made Leopold different. and being different in a family engineered for perfection came at a price. Leopold's life became a constant negotiation between risk and ritual. He was fiercely intelligent, sharp, witty, impatient with nonsense, but his world was padded. He couldn't play the way other boys did. He couldn't ride freely. Every staircase was an enemy, every corner a calculation. He wore padded clothing to soften any fall. Doctors hovered like moths, and his mother, who claimed to detest weakness, hovered too, torn between maternal fear and royal duty, never quite able to be either parent or monarch in full. And yet, despite the rules that tethered him, Leopold refused to live quietly. He was the first of Victoria's sons to attend university. Oxford, no less, and not in name only. He studied with a seriousness that startled his professors. He loved the arts, the theatre, philosophy. He wrote letters filled with dry sarcasm and painful honesty. He hated being pitied. He hated being sidelined. He hated the assumption that fragility meant inferiority. At court, he pushed back. He wanted work, responsibility, a life of meaning, not just existence. Victoria resisted. To her, Leopold was the beloved child whose survival she couldn't take for granted. To him, she was the iron wall standing between him and the life he wanted. Their correspondence is a maze of subtle guilt and veiled frustration. One letter reveals Victoria scolding him for wanting too much. Another shows Leopold begging not to be confined to insignificance. Eventually, he was granted a minor dukedom, Albany, and married a German princess, Helena of Waldeck and Piedmont. It was a strategic match, but also unexpectedly a loving one. Leopold adored her. They had a daughter, Alice, and then, before their second child could be born, Leopold went abroad, hoping the warm climate would ease his chronic pain. In 1884, in Cannes, he slipped, a simple fall. He hit his knee. The bleeding started. What followed was not publicized in any great detail, and Victoria made sure of that. In letters, she expressed horror, grief, and guilt, calling his death a terrible blow and so unnecessary. He was only 30. After his death, his wife gave birth to a posthumous son, Charles Edward, who would go on to become a duke, a sympathizer with dangerous ideologies, and a complicated historical footnote. But Leopold's legacy was not in titles or politics. It was in his defiance, his refusal to be reduced to an illness, his unrelenting demand to be seen as more than fragile. Victoria never stopped mourning him. She kept his rooms preserved, his portraits prominent, but in doing so, she also fossilized him, not as the vibrant man he was, but as the broken boy who reminded her that queens, even queens, cannot command blood, and her bloodline carried on. The gene passed through her daughters into the houses of Hohenzollern, Habsburg, and Romanov. It shaped empires, doomed princes, forced queens into silence. It turned family trees into quiet cautionary tales. But sometimes it didn't pass through blood alone. In Spain, another royal line would face a different fate, not from a hidden gene, but from a visible unraveling. A child born to rule, who instead became the empire's final question mark. A boy so warped by generations of intermarriage and unbroken power that even history struggled to look him in the face. 4. King Alfonso XIII, Spain and his sons. King Alfonso XIII of Spain was born a king, literally. He was proclaimed sovereign on the day of his birth in 1886, wrapped in silk and crowned in silence because his father had died 6 months earlier. From the beginning, Alfonso was the embodiment of royal continuity, a living symbol that Spain would endure, that monarchy was still a permanent fixture, that the line, by blood, by tradition, by divine suggestion, remained unbroken. But blood, as it turned out, would be Alfonso's undoing, specifically his son's blood. Because while the Spanish crown had always clung to the notion of purity, loyalty, and unshakable lineage, it was quietly poisoning its own posterity, and not just metaphorically. Alfonso XIII married Victoria Eugenie of Battenberg, a granddaughter of Queen Victoria, and therefore a carrier of the haemophilia gene that had already claimed lives in Britain and Russia. The match was politically convenient, but biologically disastrous. In fact, the Spanish court initially resisted the union precisely because of Victoria Eugenie's genetic inheritance. But Alfonso insisted he was in love, or at least infatuated. And royal marriages don't hinge on medical advisories. They had 7 children. At least 2 of the sons, Alfonso, Prince of Asturias, and Infante Gonzalo, were born with haemophilia. Another son, Infante Jaime, was rendered deaf due to complications from an early surgery. In a matter of years, Spain's royal future was no longer just precarious. It was bleeding out silently behind palace walls. Alfonso, the eldest, was supposed to be the next king. His childhood was carefully curated for that role. He was taught diplomacy, decorum, Spanish military history, everything a monarch needed, except how to live with an invisible, incurable illness. He suffered internal hemorrhages that left him unable to walk for weeks at a time. Every injury became an ordeal, every trip outside the palace a gamble, and yet, as with so many royals, the pressure to appear strong was relentless. His father grew increasingly distant. Alfonso XIII, once seen as an energetic modernizer, began to unravel under the weight of scandals and unrest. But nothing seemed to unsettle him more than watching his sons, one by one, reveal the vulnerability that kings were never supposed to show. The king's response: partial denial, cold detachment, and eventually disinheritance. Alfonso, the crown prince, fell in love with a commoner, a Cuban woman named Edelmira. He married her against his father's wishes. For Alfonso XIII, the issue wasn't love or class, it was legitimacy. He feared what would happen if a future heir, already carrying haemophilia, had children outside the rigid frameworks of dynastic control. So he stripped Alfonso of his titles. The boy who had been groomed for kingship became simply the Count of Covadonga, exiled by name and by diagnosis. He died in a car accident at age 31. The official cause was trauma from the crash, but those who knew his medical history understood it was the bleeding. Then there was Infante Gonzalo, cheerful, athletic, against all odds. He wore leg braces as a child, but he loved sports, especially cycling. Everyone warned him. He didn't stop. He too died from complications after a minor car accident. He was 19. Infante Jaime survived longer, but lived in a different kind of isolation. Deaf from early childhood, he struggled with speech and was often left out of state affairs. His impairment was treated more as an inconvenience than a condition. For much of his life, he was shuffled between the edges of royal responsibility and private irrelevance. At one point, he claimed the throne of France, symbolically, of course, in the confusing mess of Bourbon claims, but no one took it seriously. His own family barely acknowledged it. By the 1930s, the Spanish monarchy itself was collapsing. Alfonso XIII went into exile, haunted not just by political failure, but by the quiet catastrophe of his family tree. His legacy wasn't just the loss of the Spanish crown, it was the loss of 3 sons, each altered, erased, or destroyed by a condition that no royal seal could stop. In his final years, Alfonso made strange, contradictory moves. He abdicated. Then he denied having done so. He tried to rally monarchist support. Then he withdrew. He never returned to Spain. And when he died in Rome in 1941, he left behind a broken lineage, a dismantled throne, and a silent truth that royal blood, however sacred, is still just blood. But what happens when it's not just illness, when it's everything that goes wrong in a single body? The next royal child wasn't simply impaired. He was so distorted by generations of inbreeding and royal expectation that even his coronation felt like a tragedy. His name was Charles II, and Spain called him El Hechizado, the Bewitched. 5. King Philip IV of Spain and Charles II. By the time Charles II of Spain was born in 1661, the Habsburg dynasty had already perfected the art of falling apart in slow motion. They ruled a vast and splintering empire, part Spain, part Austria, part holy obligation, with a pedigree so tightly wound it had begun to collapse inward. Generations of cousin marriage had turned the royal bloodline into a Mobius strip. The motto might as well have been, "Keep it in the family, even if the family stops working." Charles was born into this carefully preserved genetic echo chamber, the last Habsburg king of Spain. The final boy in a long line of looping genes, papal blessings, and political delusions. His birth was announced with the usual fanfare, but behind the celebration something was off. Everyone noticed it. No one dared say it aloud. He was sickly. He was fragile. His head was too large, his jaw too long, and his body too small. He didn't walk until well after most children did. He didn't speak until he was nearly 4. As he grew older, his tongue remained swollen, his speech hard to understand, and his intellect inconsistent. His caretakers explained it away as delayed development, divine mystery, or royal gravity. But the signs were clear and worsening. Modern historians, with the benefit of science and distance, believe Charles suffered from a cascade of congenital conditions, most notably mandibular prognathism, the infamous Habsburg jaw, developmental delays, and likely multiple endocrine disorders. His extensive inbreeding, his parents were uncle and niece, and their own parents weren't much better, resulted in a genetic coefficient that reads less like ancestry and more like a closed loop. But in the 17th century, they didn't have words for that. What they had was superstition. They called him cursed, El Hechizado, the Bewitched. Rumours spread that witches or enemies of the crown had cast a spell on the boy. His strange appearance, his incoherent speech, his inability to sire heirs, his unpredictable health, they weren't signs of disability, they were signs of black magic. Exorcists were summoned, holy relics brought in, and in one famously absurd episode, Charles was forced to swallow powders made of saints' bones, as if theology could repair chromosomes. Still, he was crowned because he had to be. There were no other options, no other sons, no other lines. The empire would not allow reality to interfere with symbolism. And so Charles II reigned. Sort of. His court was run by others. First his mother, Mariana of Austria, and then a rotating cast of ministers, clerics, and opportunists. Charles, meanwhile, stumbled through life in a fog of ailments. He tried to lead, but couldn't remember key facts. He tried to marry, but couldn't produce children. He tried to speak in public, but was often unintelligible. Court records reveal a man who could be sweet, devout, even curious, but also withdrawn, erratic, and childlike. Diplomats from other countries sent letters home, describing his behavior in clinical, almost pitiful detail. They weren't mocking him. They were watching a dynasty disintegrate in real time. And yet Charles believed, in his role, in God, in the possibility that something still could be done. He consulted alchemists, prayed obsessively, endured dozens of ritual purges and medical tortures disguised as treatments, all to fix a body that was never going to cooperate. By the time he was in his late 30s, Charles's health had declined so severely that simply appearing in public was an ordeal. His second wife, Maria Anna of Neuburg, found herself both spouse and nurse, increasingly isolated and alarmed by his condition. They remained childless. No heirs, no plan B. In 1700, Charles died at the age of 38. The Spanish Habsburg line died with him. In his will, he named a French Bourbon as his successor, a move that would trigger the War of Spanish Succession and redraw the political map of Europe. But as far as his own legacy was concerned, there was nothing left to pass on. just the image of a boy who had been born a king and carried the weight of an empire in a body that could barely stand upright. What makes Charles's story so unsettling isn't just the tragedy of his life, it's the refusal by everyone around him to see the truth for what it was. Disability, in his world, could not be named. It had to be disguised, mystified, or punished. The system demanded a strong king, and when it got something else entirely, it bent history around him to maintain the illusion, until it snapped. But not all disabled royal children were born to be kings. Some, like the next boy, far north in the quiet chill of Sweden, were never meant to lead. And yet their stories still slipped through the cracks of royal secrecy, hidden not by magic or prophecy, but by polite silence. 6. King Gustav V of Sweden and Prince Eric. In the grand halls of Sweden's royal palaces, where tapestries hang like sermons and every floorboard has been polished by centuries of well-dressed denial, there once lived a prince no one really talked about. His name was Prince Eric, Duke of Westmanland, the youngest son of King Gustav V and Queen Victoria of Baden. Born in 1889, Eric entered the world under all the usual ceremonial weight. Bells rang, portraits were commissioned, and the future once again was painted in gold leaf. But the light never quite touched Eric the way it did his brothers. He was quiet, awkward, delayed in ways no one at court had language for. By the time he was a toddler, it was clear he wasn't keeping pace with the expectations placed on a royal child. He struggled with coordination, with speech, with what the era delicately called comportment. Later he would be diagnosed, retrospectively by historians, with epilepsy and a developmental disability. But in his lifetime, Sweden had no use for such terms. Instead, they had euphemisms. They called him delicate, nervous, special. Then they stopped calling him anything at all. Eric's presence in official records is thin. Photos are few. Public appearances nearly non-existent. Even in family memoirs and biographies of the Swedish court, Eric is often just a name in a list, mentioned, if at all, in a tone that suggests a story best left untold. But it wasn't always this way. For a brief moment, there was hope that he might grow into his title. As a child, he was taken to official events, dressed in the same starched collars and ceremonial sashes as his older brothers. He smiled, he tried, but the strain was visible. When his seizures began, likely in his early teens, the silence tightened. Epilepsy at the time wasn't just a medical diagnosis, it was a scandal, a moral blemish, a sign of hereditary weakness in a family that had spent centuries trying to present itself as a model of Nordic perfection. And so the doors quietly closed around him. By 1907, when his father became king, Eric had already been removed from most public life, while Crown Prince Gustav Adolf, the eldest son, future King Gustav VI Adolf, was groomed for leadership and adorned with honours. Eric was relocated. First to Ulriksdal Palace, then eventually to Drottningholm, then back again, shuttled quietly between residences with large grounds and limited access. He lived under the care of nurses, physicians, and a tightly controlled staff. He wasn't exiled exactly, just contained, close enough to be acknowledged, far enough to be forgotten. There are passing mentions of his hobbies, gardening, reading, music, but they come in second-hand accounts, always filtered through someone else's memory. A distant relative recalls him as gentle, easily startled, fond of animals. A visiting courtier once noted how he walked alone in the gardens, humming to himself. These fragments are all we have. His mother, Queen Victoria, was said to be protective of him. Some say she insisted on his isolation, believing it was for his own safety. Others say she simply couldn't bear the shame. The royal household, never known for emotional transparency, treated Eric with a kind of frozen kindness, all necessities provided, all affection withheld. He died in 1918 at the age of 29. His cause of death was listed as complications from epilepsy, though what that actually meant remains vague. There was no state funeral, no national mourning. His burial was quiet, his name eventually engraved alongside his siblings, though without fanfare. No one pretended he had lived a public life. And yet his story lingers, not in grand achievements or tragic downfalls, but in the quiet discomfort it leaves behind. What does a royal family do with a son who cannot perform royalty? They shelter him, they protect him, and they erase him. But Eric wasn't the only prince who slipped through the cracks of royal mythology. Across the North Sea in the Netherlands, a queen would give birth to a daughter whose disability came not from dynasty, but from disaster, a virus, a pregnancy. A near-blind girl born to one of Europe's most quietly stubborn monarchs. Her name was Christina, and her birth would force a royal reckoning with everything the court had spent decades avoiding. Imperfection, visibility, and fate. 7. Queen Juliana of the Netherlands and Princess Christina. When Queen Juliana of the Netherlands gave birth to her fourth daughter in 1947, it should have been routine by royal standards. Another healthy child added to a well-managed monarchy, still recovering from the scars of war. But the moment Princess Christina entered the world, the quiet choreography of palace life was interrupted. She didn't cry the way newborns usually cry. She didn't react to light the way infants should. And when they looked into her eyes, the doctors paused. They saw clouds. Her mother already knew something was wrong. During her pregnancy, Juliana had contracted rubella, German measles, a virus that often appears mild in adults but can be catastrophic for the unborn. Medical science knew this, barely. The war had left Europe with more questions than answers about virology, and in the corridors of power, silence was still the preferred treatment for inconvenient facts. Juliana, raised in the glare of Dutch Calvinism and public expectation, knew that motherhood wasn't supposed to look like this. Christina had been born nearly blind. In any other household, it would have been a private crisis. In a royal one, it became a theological riddle, a constitutional murmur, and, behind closed doors, a spiritual earthquake. The Dutch monarchy, restabilized after Nazi occupation, had rebuilt its image on moral clarity and unshakable optimism. Juliana herself was often called the People's Queen, known for her humility, her plain-spoken decency, and her preference for riding a bicycle over riding in limousines. But this was different. This was her child, and no amount of warmth or common sense could change what was now unavoidably true. Her daughter would grow up in near darkness. The family responded in pieces. Prince Bernhard, Juliana's husband, reportedly struggled. A man of his era, rank and temperament, he saw disability, especially in royalty, as a kind of insult. Not personally, of course, existentially. One doesn't inherit a throne to inherit fragility, and though he later softened, at the time he distanced himself emotionally. The birth of Christina fractured something in their marriage that never fully healed. Juliana, on the other hand, went looking for answers in the only direction she hadn't tried yet, upward. Not toward the heavens of protocol, but toward the ethereal universe of spiritualists and clairvoyants. She invited mystics into the palace, held seances, consulted healers and faith figures far outside the realm of traditional religion. To many in government and the public, this was deeply alarming. The Queen of the Netherlands, seeker of divine intervention. This wasn't how monarchs were supposed to behave. They were meant to be symbols, not searchers. But Juliana didn't care, because Christina was still blind. And for Juliana, faith, any faith, was better than doing nothing. Eventually, modern medicine intervened. Treatments became available, and Christina's vision improved slightly. Not perfectly, not entirely, but enough that she could navigate the world on her own terms. She wore thick glasses, read with difficulty, struggled with light, but she learned, and she kept learning. Music became her language, not just a hobby or royal accomplishment, but an actual lived fluency. She studied in Canada, lived in the United States, and became an accomplished singer, later teaching music and giving performances across Europe. What makes Christina's story quietly radical is not that she overcame a disability. That's a cliché people like to assign when they don't know how to process complexity. What she did was refuse the script. She turned away from royal obligations, rejected her title, and eventually relinquished her claim to the throne so she could marry a Catholic man, a decision that would have been politically toxic in earlier decades, but by the late 1970s was merely inconvenient. She didn't care. She chose freedom, and even in the family's official communications, there's a gentleness in how they remembered her, not as a symbol of struggle, but as someone who lived deliberately, curiously, and independently. When she died in 2019, the Dutch media did not sanitize her disability, nor did they dramatize it. They simply told the truth, that she had lived with it, not against it, not beneath it, with it. It was, in a quiet way, a first for a modern royal. But the path to that kind of understanding had taken centuries and countless hidden lives. Some royal children were given space, some were given silence, and some, like the next boy in Spain, were given too much power too soon. His name was Don Carlos, and his mind unraveled before the crown could ever sit on his head. 8. King Philip II of Spain and Don Carlos. Don Carlos should have been Spain's next monarch, by birthright, by ceremony, by divine expectation. He was the eldest son of King Philip II of Spain, grandson of the mighty Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, and heir to an empire where the sun allegedly never set. But when Carlos came into the world in 1545, the sun wasn't shining, not really. He was small, sickly, unsettled from the beginning, and the royal court noticed. The Habsburg dynasty had long favoured marriages between cousins and closer, unions engineered more for consolidation than compatibility. And Carlos, like Charles II, who would follow a century later, bore the genetic costs. His parents were double first cousins. His family tree was more wreath than branch. It showed. His skull was misshapen. His posture hunched, his jaw protruded, he limped, he had difficulty learning, struggled with memory, and frequently displayed unpredictable mood swings, alternating between long stretches of silence and outbursts so intense that even his caretakers, trained to tolerate royal quirks, described him as terrifying. The court physicians tried to categorize his behavior. Was it madness? A disorder of the humors? An imbalance caused by bad blood or worse prayers? None could agree. What they did agree on was that Carlos could not be left unattended. The servants were instructed to monitor his every movement. He was known to hurt animals, to destroy property, to speak in contradictions. He would refuse food for days and then gorge himself without warning. He once locked himself in a room and threatened to burn the entire palace down, and yet none of this disqualified him, at least not officially, because he was Don Carlos, heir to the Spanish crown, and in monarchies, blood mattered more than behavior. His future rule was not a question of competence, it was a question of timing. Still, there were murmurs, whispers among the nobility, concerns voiced in private corridors, coded in diplomatic reports. Foreign ambassadors wrote home in increasingly nervous tones, "The prince is unstable, his mind is weak, the kingdom is not safe in his hands." Philip II, a cold and methodical ruler, had little patience for instability, even in his own son. He watched Carlos's erratic behavior with growing alarm. The relationship between father and son deteriorated, not with one loud break, but in a slow series of political and personal withdrawals. Carlos was excluded from military councils, then barred from travel, then quietly removed from state affairs altogether. But Don Carlos did not go quietly. In 1567, he attempted to flee Spain, some say to join the rebellious Dutch provinces, others say simply to escape the ever-tightening royal grip. Whatever the plan, it failed. He was caught, dragged back to Madrid, and soon after imprisoned by his own father. Not banished, not exiled, imprisoned. Philip gave the order himself, a royal decree against his own blood. Carlos was locked in a series of rooms under heavy guard. He refused to eat. Then he begged for food. Then he fasted again. Some reports say he went days without sleep. Others say he spoke to no one but himself. All agree he was deteriorating. He died 6 months later in July of 1568. Officially, the court blamed natural causes, but even at the time, few believed it. There were rumors of poisoning, of neglect, of deliberate starvation masked as discipline. The truth was likely less conspiratorial and more tragic. Carlos died in confinement, surrounded by fear, silence, and the unbearable weight of royal expectations. His death sent ripples through Europe, not because a prince had died, but because of how. A king had locked up his own heir, and in doing so exposed the dangerous limits of divine rule. The monarchy had always claimed to be ordained by God. But what happens when God gives you a son who cannot rule, who breaks every law of decorum and sense, who turns dinner into a disaster and diplomacy into a threat? Apparently, you lock him away and say nothing more, and yet Don Carlos became a symbol, a tragic one, a warning. His life inspired plays, operas, and political manifestos, always dramatized, rarely understood. In all versions, one fact remains. The prince was broken before the crown ever touched him, but tragedy in royal families often repeats, and sometimes it isn't madness or violence that isolates a child. Sometimes it's something quieter, melancholy, doubt, the slow burn of despair. In Austria-Hungary, a beloved crown prince would go down a path no one dared stop, and the empire would never recover. 9. Emperor Franz Joseph I of Austria-Hungary and Crown Prince Rudolf. There are sons born to inherit empires. And then there are sons born with empires pressed into their lungs before they've taken their first breath. Crown Prince Rudolf of Austria-Hungary belonged to the second kind. He was the only son of Emperor Franz Joseph I and Empress Elizabeth, better known to history and melancholy romantics as Sisi. Born in 1858, Rudolf was the future of one of Europe's oldest and most crumbling thrones. The Austro-Hungarian Empire stretched from the Alps to the Balkans, from Vienna's polite salons to the chaotic borders of Eastern Europe. It was old, proud, and already dying when Rudolf was just a boy, and he knew it. From the beginning, Rudolf was not what his father wanted. Franz Joseph was a strict conservative, a military man, a walking stone monument in a spiked helmet. He believed in order, hierarchy, God's will, and the invincibility of empires. Rudolf, by contrast, was a reader, a writer. He studied philosophy and science. He liked poetry. He questioned authority. He had liberal ideals. Worst of all, he had feelings. The emperor tried to toughen him up. Military drills, harsh tutors, emotional coldness, the usual royal parenting regimen. It didn't work. Rudolf learned to play the part, but never bought into the script. His letters are full of sharp observations and growing dread. He wrote of being lonely in spirit, of feeling like a prisoner of iron routines. He could mimic the form of a Habsburg, but his heart beat to an entirely different rhythm. And then came the isolation. The empire had no room for ambiguity, especially not in its heir. Rumors began circulating early about his fragile health, his emotional instability, his unpredictable moods. He had periods of intense energy, followed by weeks of withdrawal. His handwriting changed, his weight fluctuated. He was, by modern understanding, likely struggling with a form of severe depression or bipolar disorder. But in the late 19th century, this was labeled something more dangerous: weakness. When Rudolf was 23, he married Princess Stephanie of Belgium. It was a political match, obligatory and uninspired. They had one child, a daughter, and little else. The marriage soured quickly. Rudolf took lovers. His moods grew darker. He drank more. His views became sharper, more radical. He began writing anonymously in liberal newspapers, criticizing his own father's policies, mocking the monarchy's rigidity, calling for reform. To the court, it was mutiny. To Franz Joseph, it was betrayal. The Crown Prince, the very emblem of continuity, was unraveling before the entire empire's eyes. And no one knew what to do with him. He was too high-ranking to remove, too fragile to trust, too symbolic to ignore. Eventually he found solace, or something like it, with a young woman named Mary Vetsera. She was 17, he was 30. Their affair began quietly and ended in what the world would later call the Meierling incident. Rudolph and Mary were found dead in his hunting lodge at Meierling in 1889. The official story was vague and immediate, a tragic accident, later amended to a suicide pact. But the truth was tangled, murky, and wrapped in decades of damage control. Royal physicians, clergymen, and politicians worked quickly to sanitize the narrative. The church gave permission for burial in hallowed ground despite the scandal. The empress collapsed. The emperor withdrew further into his uniform, and the empire began counting down the days it had left. Rudolph's death didn't just remove a crown prince, it created a vacuum. His cousin, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, eventually took his place in the line of succession, and Franz Ferdinand's assassination in Sarajevo would spark the First World War. The threads are delicate but direct. One man's breakdown, misunderstood, untreated, quietly buried, helped set fire to the old world. But the story they told of Rudolph wasn't that. It was simpler, easier. He was troubled. He was emotional. He was a sensitive soul who met a tragic end. What they never said, and what history still struggles to say, is this: the system that created him also destroyed him. He was raised to be an emperor and denied the space to be a person. The empire expected obedience, he gave them questions, and then silence. But even silence echoes, and it echoed far beyond the Austro-Hungarian borders, into the Balkans, the East, and toward a smaller kingdom where another crown prince, just as high-born and just as volatile, would one day be declared insane. His name was George, and in Serbia his madness wasn't hidden. It was declared, official, a royal crisis filed under medicine, or something like it. 10. King Peter I of Serbia and Crown Prince George. In the quiet corridors of Balkan history, Crown Prince George of Serbia walks like a ghost with muddy boots, loud, erratic, difficult to ignore, and impossible to clean up. He was supposed to be the future. Instead, he became the warning. Born in 1887 to Peter Karađorđević, later King Peter I of Serbia, George arrived into a family that had clawed its way back from exile. His father's line, the House of Karađorđević, had been dethroned decades earlier and only returned to power in 1903 after a violent coup removed the rival Obrenović dynasty. That return wasn't just political, it was symbolic. Serbia had chosen national pride over foreign compromise. It had chosen strength over subtlety, and George, as the firstborn son of this newly restored dynasty, was expected to embody that choice. He tried. From a young age, George was intense, intelligent, multilingual, brave to the point of recklessness. He was educated in Geneva and St. Petersburg, raised with the full weight of Serbian nationalism on one shoulder and European aristocratic expectations on the other. Military training, of course, etiquette, occasionally, self-control, not so much. He had a temper, not just a royal one, but something more electric, less containable. He lashed out at servants, at animals, at courtiers. He rode horses too fast, shouted during meals, challenged authority without hesitation. His charisma was undeniable. So was the danger of being near him when he was in one of his unpredictable moods. The court whispered, but only when he wasn't around. In 1909, at age 22, George made a single shocking mistake that would haunt him forever. During a confrontation at the royal palace, he kicked his valet, a man named Stephen Kolakovic. The blow was so severe, Kolakovich later died from internal injuries. It was an act of violence that couldn't be waved away by protocol or excuses, and unlike in many other monarchies, Serbia didn't have centuries of refined denial machinery to sweep it under the rug. George was forced to renounce his title as Crown Prince. Officially, it was framed as voluntary, a noble act of self-reflection. In truth, it was a political necessity. The scandal could have collapsed the entire Karađorđević restoration. Serbia needed a symbol of modern rule, not a volatile prince with blood on his boots and rage in his voice. His younger brother Alexander was named heir in his place. George was removed from the spotlight, but he wasn't removed from history. He continued to serve in the military during the Balkan Wars and World War I. In fact, by some accounts, he fought with extraordinary courage, but the public image never recovered. He became a figure of contradiction, heroic yet unstable, brilliant yet impulsive, loyal yet untrustworthy. He was a man haunted by his own worst decision, and by a royal system that had no script for what to do with a prince who didn't behave. In 1925, his story took another turn. This time darker. His brother Alexander, now king, signed the order to have George declared legally insane and committed to an asylum. It was sudden, official, clean. What exactly triggered the decision remains murky. Some say George had grown erratic again. Others claim it was political, a way to ensure there would be no rival claims to the throne, no unpredictable family members stirring nationalist sentiment. George protested, of course, but the diagnosis was handed down. He was institutionalized at the Toponica Psychiatric Hospital near Niš. He remained there for nearly 2 decades. Reports from his confinement vary. Some depict him as withdrawn, subdued. Others describe bursts of energy, philosophical conversations, bitter monologues about his lost future. He read constantly. He wrote letters. He waited. After Alexander's assassination in 1934, George's name returned to the political margins. With the upheaval of World War II and the eventual abolition of the monarchy by Yugoslavia's communist government, George finally was released. Not restored, just released. He lived quietly in Belgrade until his death in 1972 at the age of 85. A prince, a soldier, a cautionary tale. Today, he is remembered with a kind of historical discomfort, too dangerous to canonize, too tragic to ignore. Serbia has yet to decide whether he was mad, misunderstood, or merely human in a system that had no tolerance for imperfection. But the idea of royal sanity has always been fragile, and the cost of failing to meet its standards often falls not on the crown, but on the child wearing it, as it did in Prussia, where a future king would suffer a series of strokes that stripped him of speech, movement, and autonomy, while the empire politely pretended nothing had changed. 11. King Frederick William III of Prussia and Frederick William IV. In the vast hallways of Prussian history, where everything was measured in discipline, punctuality, and perfect posture, few stories feel as quietly unsettling as that of Frederick William IV. He was the eldest son of King Frederick William III and Queen Louise of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, a prince bred for logic, authority, and iron-handed governance. Instead, he became something the Prussian machine was deeply unprepared for. Fragile. Not at first, of course. Born in 1795, Frederick William IV came into a world teetering between the Enlightenment and the wreckage left by Napoleon. Prussia was bruised but ambitious, and young Frederick was shaped by tutors who filled his head with classical ideals, architecture, romanticism, and an abiding obsession with art and religion. He spoke multiple languages. He sketched dreamlike cathedrals. He could quote ancient philosophers by age 15 and had a painter's soul trapped in a soldier's upbringing. But being dreamy in Prussia wasn't a lifestyle. It was a liability. His father, King Frederick William III was famously rigid, an administrator with the charisma of wet stone, who believed that governance was a matter of paperwork and divine will. He tolerated his son's idealism because it hadn't yet become an obstacle, but everyone at court saw it coming. This boy was not made for war, not built for cold diplomacy or the mechanical pulse of Prussian bureaucracy. His handwriting was too ornate, his sentences too long, his judgments too delayed. Still he rose, because that's what heirs do. Frederick William IV ascended the throne in 1840, inheriting a kingdom itching for modernization and political reform. Europe, meanwhile, was on the edge of revolution. Liberals wanted constitutions, workers wanted rights, monarchs wanted quiet. And Frederick, poor romantic Frederick, wanted to build churches, read poetry, and avoid any kind of confrontation. His reign began with small concessions. He eased censorship, released a few political prisoners, promised to consider representative government, and then almost as quickly pulled back. He didn't believe in revolutions, but he didn't believe in crushing them either. He believed in divine harmony, a kind of sacred balance between ruler and ruled that existed mostly in his imagination and nowhere in his policies. In 1848, when revolutions broke out across Europe, Berlin caught fire with protest, and for a moment it looked like Frederick William might become the liberal monarch his subjects wanted. He even appeared wearing the revolutionary tricolour sash, promised reforms, allowed a national assembly, hailed the spirit of the people. Then, a few months later, he reversed course entirely. He dissolved the assembly, reimposed restrictions, turned down the crown of a unified Germany when it was offered by the Frankfurt Parliament, famously declaring he would not accept a crown from the gutter, because, in his mind, monarchy was bestowed by God, not by elected committees. That phrase followed him for the rest of his life. But his decline wasn't just political, it was physical, neurological, private. Beginning in the mid-1850s, Frederick William began experiencing episodes that his court could not explain. His thoughts drifted mid-conversation, his hands trembled, he stared too long at nothing. Then came the first stroke, then the second, then a series of smaller ones, each more devastating than the last. By 1858, he was incapable of ruling in any meaningful way. He could not walk without assistance. His speech had deteriorated into garbled fragments. His mind, once full of dreams and cathedrals, had become a silent museum of unreachable rooms. The court issued formal statements. He was resting, in recovery, delegating responsibilities. But everyone knew the Prussian monarch had become a ceremonial figure, present but unreachable, and in a state built on steel, structure, and absolute command, there was no precedent for a sovereign who could no longer speak. His brother Wilhelm, more conservative, more pragmatic, was appointed regent. Eventually, he would become Kaiser Wilhelm I, the first emperor of a unified Germany. But Frederick William IV would live for another 3 years, confined to the shadows of Charlottenburg Palace, surrounded by caretakers and dignified silences. He died in 1861, and the empire barely paused to grieve. What he left behind was not a reign of power, but a question. What happens when the soul of a monarch outlasts his body, but not his usefulness? Prussia didn't answer, it just moved on. But in another empire, older, more layered, and far more theatrical, this same question would resurface. A child would be born to rule, celebrated as brilliant, divine, and essential. And then he would unravel slowly, publicly, and permanently, until the only thing people remembered was how strange he had become. His name was Rudolf, but history would call him something else. The emperor who turned his court into a cabinet of alchemy, shadows, and silence. 12th Emperor Maximilian II and Rudolf II. There are rulers remembered for conquest, others for reform, a rare few for the soft power of diplomacy. And then there's Emperor Rudolf II of the Holy Roman Empire, remembered mostly for losing touch with reality while still being expected to govern it. He was the son of Emperor Maximilian II and Maria of Spain, born in 1552 into one of the most powerful and politically entangled dynasties Europe had ever produced, the Habsburgs. This was a family tree that didn't branch so much as fold in on itself, a house built on thrones, marriage contracts, and Catholic absolutes. By the time Rudolf arrived, the Habsburgs ruled an empire so vast it could barely be mapped, much less managed. He was raised to be its future, and for a time he looked the part. Educated in Spain under the stiff grandeur of the court of Philip II, Rudolf's early life was shaped by formality, ritual, and fear. He was shy, sensitive, obedient to a fault. His letters from adolescence show an almost painful eagerness to please, but behind the courtly manners was a growing undercurrent of unease. He suffered from long periods of melancholy. He withdrew from his tutors, isolated himself from his peers, and spoke of a darkness that never seemed to lift. Today, historians would call it chronic mental illness, likely a form of bipolar disorder or depression. Back then, it was just called sorrow, and sorrow wasn't a liability in the Habsburg court until it got in the way of politics. Rudolf was crowned Holy Roman Emperor in 1576. He inherited not just the throne, but an entire region teetering between the old world and the early fires of modernity. The Protestant Reformation was tearing Europe in half. The Catholic Church was demanding obedience with increasing desperation. Science was whispering dangerous truths. And magic, yes, magic, was still something the powerful dabbled in behind locked doors. Rudolf was enthralled by it all. He moved the imperial court from Vienna to Prague, a city that suited his temperament. Foggy, mystical, caught between reason and dream. There, in the twisted alleys and cold stone halls of Hrachany Castle, he created what can only be described as a royal curiosity cabinet the size of a government. His court became a magnet for artists, philosophers, scientists, and mystics. He invited astronomers like Tycho Brahe and Johannes Kepler to study the stars in imperial towers, alchemists to search for eternal life in his basements. He collected mechanical toys, religious relics, optical illusions, and skeletons. If it glittered, puzzled, or promised hidden truth, Rudolf wanted it catalogued. This wasn't just eccentricity, it was obsession. The emperor, who could barely bring himself to attend meetings with his own council, would spend hours staring into astronomical charts or watching automata click and whirl across polished tables. His court, though culturally vibrant, became politically paralyzed. Religious tensions boiled over. Protestant estates demanded concessions. Catholic loyalists grew restless. The empire, already an administrative labyrinth, began to stall under the weight of its absent-minded architect. And Rudolf himself, he began to unravel. His moods shifted violently. He went days without speaking to anyone, then would erupt into frenzied planning sessions that ended in total confusion. He feared plots against him, some real, most imagined. He stopped bathing, stopped leaving the palace, sometimes refused food. He surrounded himself with servants and animals, but trusted almost no one. In 1608, his younger brother Matthias, more pragmatic, more focused, began to quietly seize control. One province at a time, Rudolf's authority shrank. First Hungary, then Austria, then Moravia. Finally, in 1611, the Bohemian estates revolted against Rudolf's rule, forcing him to abdicate the crown of Bohemia, his last real possession. By then, he was emperor in name only. He died in 1612 in his palace, surrounded by objects, not people. Rudolf left behind no wife, no heirs, and no political legacy worth defending. What he did leave was a strange and shimmering cultural footprint, a court where science and superstition shared wine, where melancholy was carved into marble, and where one man tried to rule the world while slowly losing his grip on his own mind. To his subjects, he had been a riddle, unreadable, unreliable, and unrelenting in his belief that knowledge was worth more than control. But empires don't run on riddles, they run on order, and the order had moved on without him. But mental fragility wasn't unique to emperors or confined to ivory towers. It visited sultans too. Even in the heart of the Ottoman Empire, home of janissaries, silk-robed courtiers, and calligraphic absolutism, the mind could become a palace under siege, and the next prince would prove it. His name was Ibrahim. The court called him the Mad. 13. Sultan Ahmed I, Ottoman, and Ibrahim I, the Mad, in the Ottoman Empire, where succession was often decided by survival rather than seniority. The line between throne and prison was alarmingly thin. A prince could spend his entire life preparing to rule, only to be strangled the moment his brother ascended. Or he could be forgotten in the shadows, and then one day be told, "You're Sultan now." Such was the fate of Ibrahim I, youngest son of Sultan Ahmed I. Born in 1615, Ibrahim came into the world under the looming weight of dynastic paranoia. By the time he was old enough to walk, his father had died, and with him gone, the Ottoman practice of fratricide, killing royal brothers to secure the throne, was still very much in practice. But Ibrahim wasn't killed. He was spared and instead confined to the cafes, or cage, a set of isolated apartments within the imperial palace where surplus princes were kept in luxurious captivity. It was a gilded prison, a place designed to prevent rebellion without committing fratricide. But it was also a place where minds frayed, and Ibrahim would spend the next 2 decades in this psychological limbo. He lived through the reigns of his older brother Murad IV and watched his other siblings die one by one, either from execution or illness. Ibrahim became the last male heir of the House of Osman. When Murad died in 1640, the palace guards had to break into Ibrahim's quarters to convince him that he was now Sultan. He didn't believe them. He reportedly accused them of trickery, believing it was a plot to lure him out and kill him. This wasn't political theatre, it was trauma. Ibrahim had been caged for so long with no companions, no purpose, and no certainty of survival that the very idea of being Sultan seemed like a hallucination. When he did take the throne, he was 25 years old, mentally fragile, emotionally erratic, and wholly unprepared for rule. The early months of his reign offered a flicker of hope. He appointed competent ministers, seemed eager to prove himself, and even initiated a few reforms. But it didn't last. Over time, the isolation, paranoia, and pressure, compounded by possible underlying mental illness, began to surface in public ways. He became increasingly unpredictable. Courtiers described him as impulsive, deeply suspicious, and consumed by irrational fears. He withdrew from politics, developed compulsive behaviors, and surrounded himself with sycophants who reinforced his instability rather than managing it. The court, aware of the political danger, tried to shield the empire from his volatility. Power increasingly shifted to his mother, Kozum Sultan, who acted as regent in all but name. Ministers operated around Ibrahim rather than through him. By 1648, it was clear that the situation was untenable. Famine and military setbacks had weakened the state. The janissaries, the empire's elite military corps, mutinied. The ulama, or religious scholars, issued legal justifications for deposition, and Ibrahim was deposed by his own court. Later that year, he was executed, not as a prince, but as a sultan who had ruled and lost the confidence of his empire. His reign was short, chaotic, and painful, but his story is not just about mental illness. It's about what happens when a dynastic machine prioritizes lineage over well-being, ritual over reality. Ibrahim wasn't just unstable, he was broken long before he ever had the chance to be sultan, and the Ottomans would see this pattern again most vividly in the tragic figure of Murad V, another monarch whose reign began with hope and ended with whispered diagnoses and a locked room. 14. Sultan Abdulmajid I and Murad V in the long tapestry of Ottoman succession, stitched with blood, bureaucracy, and absolute power. Few threads are as short and tangled as that of Murad V. He ruled the empire for just 93 days, not because he was overthrown by rebellion, not because he died in battle, not because he lost a war, but because, after 3 months on the throne, the palace declared him mentally unfit to rule. And in an empire that had survived on illusions of divine strength, that declaration hit harder than most invasions. Murad was born in 1840, the son of Sultan Abdulmajid I and a concubine named Shev Kefsa. His father was one of the more reform-minded Ottoman sultans, championing the Tanzimat reforms, an attempt to modernize the empire without tearing it apart. The reforms included new legal codes, modern education, and the cautious borrowing of European ideas. Murad grew up at the edge of that ideological shift, raised in a palace that was still Ottoman in structure but increasingly Western in mood. He was given a European-style education. He spoke fluent French, loved classical music, admired liberal philosophers, and read extensively about constitutional monarchies. By all appearances, he was bright, curious, and deeply idealistic. The kind of prince who believed the empire could be saved, not by swords, but by reason. But ideals don't do well in cages. And like so many Ottoman heirs before him, Murad spent much of his early adulthood in confinement, housed within the walls of the palace, kept under strict surveillance, and allowed almost no role in governance. Even letters were monitored, conversations filtered, his friendships limited to a carefully managed circle of tutors, eunuchs, and family. By the time he was in his 30s, Murad had developed a tendency toward melancholia. He grew withdrawn, anxious. Some accounts describe him as shy to the point of discomfort. Others say he was prone to long silences, even in company. But none of this disqualified him, at least not yet, because the reigning sultan, Murad's uncle Abdulaziz, had become increasingly unpopular. His extravagant spending, erratic policies, and disregard for reform had stirred unrest in both the military and civilian spheres. The empire was under pressure, from debt, from nationalism, from Europe, and the palace needed a new face, a different kind of ruler. In May 1876, a coalition of ministers, military leaders, and reformists staged a palace coup. Abdulaziz was deposed, and Murad was placed on the throne. It was, on paper, a bloodless transition. The empire called it a restoration of order, but Murad was not ready. In the days following his accession, witnesses describe him as disoriented. He reportedly experienced hallucinations. He had difficulty sleeping. His speech became disjointed, his behavior unpredictable. There were whispers of mental collapse. The palace doctors were summoned. The court grew tense. Behind the scenes, the question wasn't just whether Murad was fit to rule. It was whether the empire could afford a sultan who couldn't project stability. The reformers who had backed him now feared they had replaced a bad sultan with a broken one, and time was running out. Diplomatic cables from the period speak in coded language. The sultan is unwell. The situation requires immediate remedy. A change may be imminent. Within weeks, plans were being drawn for a second transition, this time from Murad to his younger brother, Abdul Hamid II. On August 31st, 1876, just 93 days after his coronation, Murad V was officially deposed on grounds of mental instability. The official statement cited mental exhaustion. The press said little. The empire didn't want to dwell on the implications. It had another sultan now, one who could speak clearly, walk confidently, sign decrees without hesitation. Murad, meanwhile, was escorted quietly to the Turan Palace on the Bosphorus. Not as a prisoner, not as a guest, somewhere in between. He would live there for the next 28 years, under heavy guard, with only occasional visits from family and rare glimpses of the outside world. Over time, his condition stabilized. He composed music, wrote poetry, spoke with clarity. By many accounts, he lived with dignity and retained his intellect. But it didn't matter. He was no longer a symbol of possibility. He was a risk. He died in 1904, still in confinement, never reinstated, rarely remembered. Murad V remains one of the shortest reigning monarchs in Ottoman history, but the length of his reign isn't what makes his story so haunting. It's the swiftness with which the system discarded him, not because he failed, but because he faltered. And faltering in royal houses is always punished. But not all royal children were punished by exile or palace confinement. Some were punished more directly, through fear, through power, and in at least one infamous case, through blinding. The Mughal prince Khusrau Mirza knew this all too well. His failure wasn't a matter of weakness. It was political, and the punishment left him permanently changed. 15. Emperor Jahangir and Khusrau Mirza. The Mughal Empire at its peak was a paradox, dazzling and brutal, intellectually rich yet politically paranoid. It produced gardens that rivaled paradise and courts that whispered betrayal in 7 languages. Amid all that splendor, Khusrau Mirza was born in 1587, a prince groomed for greatness, adored by poets, and doomed by the one thing an empire could never forgive: ambition pointed in the wrong direction. He was the eldest son of Prince Salim, later Emperor Jahangir, and the grandson of Akbar the Great, the empire's most legendary ruler, and for a time Khusrau seemed destined to follow in that lineage. He was intelligent, charismatic, and fluent in the symbolic grammar of Mughal nobility. He knew how to ride, how to recite verse, how to stand still in silence for hours when necessary. In portraits, he appears regal but distant, like a boy rehearsing the role of emperor before the curtain's even been drawn. But Khusrau was also born into one of the most treacherous periods in Mughal succession history, and that's saying something. Akbar's later years were marked by mounting tensions with his son, Salim. The two clashed over politics, advisors, and most of all, control. Salim grew impatient, even rebellious. At one point, he declared himself emperor in his father's absence. Akbar forgave, but never forgot. He turned his attention to his grandson Khusrau, perhaps seeing in the boy the kind of tempered wisdom Salim lacked, which of course only made things worse. When Akbar died in 1605, Salim became Jahangir, the new emperor, crowned by inheritance but still haunted by old rivalries. Khusrau, now in his late teens, watched from the sidelines as his father took the throne with suspicion already festering in his court. Rumours swirled. Was Khusrau the chosen heir of Akbar? Did he command secret loyalty among nobles? Was he planning something? Yes, he was. Within a year of Jahangir's coronation, Khusrau launched a rebellion. He rallied support from disaffected nobles and regional governors. He marched north with a modest force, gaining followers as he went. For a brief moment, it seemed like history might pivot in his favor, but the rebellion was clumsy. Khusrau lacked the military skill and political timing of a seasoned insurgent. Jahangir's forces caught up quickly. The prince was defeated near Lahore and captured alive, and that, oddly, was the problem. Had he died in battle, Khusrau might have been remembered as a tragic prince, a cautionary tale, a footnote. But surviving meant punishment. And Jahangir, both a father and an emperor, had to choose which role he valued more. He chose emperor. Khusrau was paraded through the streets in chains, a deliberate spectacle, a warning. He was then imprisoned, interrogated, and finally subjected to a punishment common in royal courts, but rarely spoken of with honesty: blinding. Accounts differ on how it happened. Some say it was partial, others say complete, some say it was botched, others that it was ceremonial. But all agree Khusrau was permanently disabled, not just physically, but politically. In Mughal law and custom, a blind prince could not rule. The empire had a simple solution to complex threats: make them impossible. Afterward, Khusrau was kept under close watch. his health declined, his status faded. He became a symbol not of rebellion, but of ruined potential. A man whose eyes had once been fixed on the peacock throne, now unable to see it at all. He died in 1622 under murky circumstances, reportedly strangled on the orders of his brother, Prince Khurram, soon to be crowned as Emperor Shah Jahan, the same Shah Jahan who would later build the Taj Mahal, a monument to eternal love after ordering the elimination of his rival sibling. But Khusrau's story remains a kind of anti-monument, a quiet, uncomfortable truth in a dynasty built on pageantry. He was a prince with everything: bloodline, charisma, legitimacy, and it still wasn't enough, because the Mughal court, like so many royal systems, could tolerate incompetence, arrogance, even cruelty, but never vulnerability. And what's more vulnerable than being a royal child used, then discarded, by the very system that created him? Yet even Khusrau's fate, bleak as it was, remains wrapped in at least some historical clarity. Not all cases are that lucky. In ancient India, centuries before the Mughals rose, a prince named Kunala was blinded too. But his story lives only in the folds of legend, moral parable, and the uneasy intersection of politics and devotion. 16. Emperor Ashoka and Kunala. In the long arc of Indian imperial history, few figures cast a shadow as wide or as paradoxical as Emperor Ashoka. He began his reign drenched in conquest and ended it draped in Buddhism, issuing edicts of peace across a land he had once carved with war. But buried in the quieter folds of his legacy lies a darker, more ambiguous story, one not inscribed on pillars or carved into cave walls, a story not about the emperor but his son, Kunala. The tale of Kunala is one of those imperial legends that exists somewhere between memory and morality play. Passed down in the Ashoka a Buddhist chronicle compiled centuries after the events it describes, it may not be verifiable in the strictest historical sense, but the story has endured, not because of how well it's documented, but because of how deeply it resonates with the uneasy truths of power, legacy, and betrayal. Kunala was the son of Ashoka and one of his chief consorts, often identified as Queen Padmavati. By all accounts, he was a gifted child, noble, intelligent, trained in the arts of diplomacy and scripture, and reportedly a favorite of his father. There was even a time when it was assumed he would succeed Ashoka and carry forward the Mauryan Empire's new Buddhist vision. But, as always, royal succession had little to do with merit and everything to do with politics. One version of the legend paints Kunala as a dutiful son sent on a mission to Taxila, a region in the northwest of the empire, prone to periodic unrest. There, he was to serve as governor, a role both prestigious and perilous. But before leaving, a strange request is said to have arrived at the palace in Pataliputra, a letter allegedly from Ashoka instructing the local authorities in Taxila to blind the prince upon his arrival. The problem? Ashoka never wrote such a letter. It had been forged, most likely by someone inside the palace. Some versions blame a rival queen, jealous of Kunala's standing and eager to see her own son rise in the line of succession. Others suggest it was the result of broader court intrigue, a Byzantine knot of loyalties and ambitions that needed only the smallest push to turn lethal. Whatever the case, the result was the same. The emperor's son, loyal and innocent, was mutilated under the guise of imperial command. And yet, the cruelty of the act is only half the story. The other half lies in what Kunala did next. Rather than seek revenge or even return to court in anger, Kunala embraced a life of renunciation. According to the Ashoka he became a wandering ascetic, trading titles for robes, exchanging the promise of the throne for the certainty of spiritual solitude. Some tellings describe him visiting Ashoka years later, not with bitterness but with forgiveness, revealing the truth of what had happened only after the emperor, burdened by guilt and confusion, asked for it. Ashoka, overcome with remorse, is said to have offered to abdicate, in Kunala's favor. But Kunala refused. He had by then detached himself from worldly power. The palace, once a promise, had become irrelevant. Whether or not the story unfolded exactly that way is beside the point. What matters is that it existed at all. In an empire known for edicts and sermons, this legend survived because it asked a question that even the emperor couldn't answer. What happens when power turns on its own children? Kunala's blinding was more than an act of palace cruelty. It was a symbolic undoing of imperial destiny, a way of removing a prince not just from succession, but from sight, from memory, from history. And yet history remembered him, not as a ruler, but as a reminder that royal families often fear their brightest heirs, that palaces can forge the very betrayals they claim to prevent, that a throne is not a guarantee of safety, but often the opposite. And centuries later, in another land of stone monuments and divine rule, another royal child would be born into that same contradiction, not in India, but in Egypt, not into Buddhist sermons, but sun-worshipping heresy. A boy king so famously entombed that most people forget he was disabled long before he was ever dead. His name was Tutankhamun, and what the world would find in his tomb was not just gold, but the quiet evidence of a body that bore the cost of dynastic ambition. 17. Pharaoh Akhenaten and Tutankhamun. By the time Tutankhamun took the throne of Egypt, the country had already spent a generation balancing on the edge of ideological collapse. His father, or possibly his brother, depending on which scholar you ask, was Pharaoh Akhenaten, the heretic king who dismantled centuries of tradition to worship a single god, the Aten, represented not as a man or beast, but as a sun disk with reaching rays. This was monotheism, avant-garde and absolute, imposed on a civilization built on thousands of gods. The result was cultural whiplash. Temples were shuttered, priests were sidelined, the capital moved, the art changed, and so did the royal family. Tutankhamun was born into this experimental Egypt sometime around 1341 BCE. His original name was Tutankhaten, living image of Aten, signaling his place in Akhenaten's new order. But the order was already crumbling. The people murmured. The gods, long worshipped in every village and tomb, had not vanished as easily as court decrees demanded. And into this religious and political confusion came a child with a frail body and a name too heavy for his spine. The image that most people carry of Tutankhamun is a golden mask, gleaming, serene, eternal. But the real boy behind that mask was anything but immortal. His body, revealed by modern CT scans and forensic archaeology, told a more intimate story. One of deformity, pain, and struggle. Tutankhamun had a clubfoot. Possibly both feet were deformed, but the left was especially damaged, twisted and weakened, likely causing him to limp. He also suffered from a condition known as Kola disease, a bone disorder that affects the feet, leading to pain and mobility issues. Dozens of walking sticks were found in his tomb, not as symbols of kingship, but as actual tools he likely used in daily life. Some showed signs of heavy wear, others had been broken and mended. They weren't props, they were necessary. His spine showed signs of scoliosis, his chest was narrow, his immune system, weakened by multiple congenital issues, made him vulnerable to infections. DNA analysis suggests he contracted malaria multiple times during his short life. His teeth were irregular, his face less symmetrical than the golden mask would suggest. And then, of course, there was his family tree. The royal bloodline had folded in on itself. Tutankhamun's parents were likely siblings, full or half, which was not unusual in Egyptian dynasties, where divine status was often protected through incest. But the genetic cost of this insularity was high. Tutankhamun was the end result. A fragile boy born into a collapsing experiment, tasked with restoring a world he could barely walk through. And yet, he became king. He ascended the throne around age 9, not as a bold reformer, but as a ceremonial figure, the empire's apology for his father's heresy. His name was changed to Tutankhamun, living image of Amun, signaling a return to the traditional gods. The temples reopened, the old priesthood reclaimed its place, but Tutankhamun himself remained in the shadows, guided by advisors like Ai and Horemheb, who effectively ruled in his name. He reigned for less than a decade, long enough to see the capital moved back to Thebes, long enough to oversee the symbolic undoing of his father's religious revolution, but not long enough to stabilize the empire or produce a secure heir. He died around age 18 or 19. The cause is still debated: malaria, complications from his clubfoot, an infected leg fracture. What is known is that his death was sudden and that his burial was rushed. The tomb was unusually small for a pharaoh. The paintings inside were hastily done. Some artifacts were repurposed from earlier reigns. In life, he had been royal but fragile. In death, he was forgotten. For centuries, he was barely a footnote in Egyptian history. A boy king with no legacy, no pyramid, no mythic wars, until 1922. When Howard Carter opened the tomb of Tutankhamun, the world gasped at the treasure, the gold, the craftsmanship, the sheer undisturbed splendor of it all. But behind the mask was still the boy, the cane-using, pain-stricken, inbred teenager who had ruled one of the greatest civilizations in history, not through strength, but through symbolism. He was a vessel for Egypt's recovery, and in a cruel twist, that very symbolism allowed his body and his frailty to survive the ages, preserved better than any of the mighty conquerors before or after him. But dynasties, like bodies, break. And centuries later, in the highlands of East Africa, another emperor would face the slow and public undoing of his heir. This time, not by assassination, rebellion, or ancient disease, but by a sudden stroke that left the future of a dynasty hanging by a thread. That heir was Amhar Selassie, son of Ethiopia's last emperor, and a prince whose legacy was shaped by both silence and survival. 18. Emperor Haile Selassie I and Amhar Selassie. In the long sweep of Ethiopia's imperial history, stretching back into myth, stitched with Solomonic legends and crowned with gold crosses, few figures loom as large as Haile Selassie I, the last emperor of a dynasty that claimed descent from the biblical King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. But while Selassie commanded global reverence and domestic reverence-tinged resentment, the story of his son, Amhar Selassie, remains far more subdued, almost whispered, not because Amhar was unimportant, but because he embodied something that monarchies struggle to admit: vulnerability in the line of succession. Born in 1916 as Asfaw Wasson Tafari, the Crown Prince of Ethiopia was always destined to inherit a throne built more on symbolism than steel. Haile Selassie had turned the Ethiopian monarchy into a diplomatic force, a unique African empire untouched by colonization, save for the 5-year Italian occupation, a proud Orthodox Christian kingdom standing alone amid a continent carved up by foreign powers. The emperor was a master of visibility. He appeared in photographs flanked by lions, in newsreels meeting world leaders, in scripture-sized biographies written for global audiences. But his son, his heir, he was far less seen. From childhood, Amhar Selassie was groomed to rule, but with caution. He was educated abroad, spoke fluent English and French, and was known for his thoughtful demeanor. Observers described him as soft-spoken, serious, perhaps a little stiff. Where Haile Selassie thrived on spectacle, Amhar seemed weighed down by it. He carried his royal expectations like a man aware of how breakable they were. And then, in 1973, everything changed. That year, Amhar Selassie suffered a massive stroke while traveling abroad. It left him partially paralyzed and with severe speech impairment. He was 57 years old. Just 1 year away from the revolution that would bring down the monarchy his father had built over half a century. The timing was cruel. Ethiopia at the time was buckling under drought, famine, political discontent, and mounting criticism of the imperial system. The monarchy needed stability. It needed a future that could speak, walk, appear, reassure. Instead, it had a crown prince who now used a wheelchair and could barely communicate in public. His mind remained sharp, but his body would no longer cooperate with the rituals of kingship. Haile Selassie, ever the political tactician, downplayed the severity of the stroke. But within the royal court it was clear. The succession had been destabilized. Whispers began, some suggesting bypassing Amha altogether, others pushing for a regency. The emperor resisted. To do so would be to admit that physical impairment was equivalent to incapacity. And in a monarchy built on divine right, such an admission would ripple outward into disaster. The disaster came anyway. In 1974, the Derg, a Marxist military junta, seized power in a bloodless coup. Haile Selassie was deposed, later imprisoned, and eventually died under murky circumstances in captivity. The monarchy was abolished. Ethiopia declared itself a socialist state. Amha Selassie, already abroad for medical treatment, never returned to claim the throne. His name was scrubbed from official memory, a living heir who was, for the state's purposes, politically irrelevant. But he didn't disappear. From exile, Amha became the symbolic leader of Ethiopian royalists. In 1989, from his home in London, he declared himself emperor in exile, Amha Selassie I, a gesture that carried no real power but immense emotional weight for the Ethiopian diaspora. Though paralyzed and largely non-verbal, he still held court. He presided over ceremonial functions, greeted guests, and kept alive the embers of a monarchy that had already become memory. He died in 1997 in Virginia, far from Addis Ababa, far from the empire he had once been trained to inherit. Amha Selassie's story isn't one of drama or palace intrigue. It's the story of a quiet undoing, a slow erosion of imperial certainty brought on not by rebellion or ambition, but by illness. He was a man who carried his empire not in power, but in posture. Sitting upright in a wheelchair, he became the embodied contradiction of monarchy, divinely chosen, but human after all. And long before Ethiopia's last emperor fell, another ruler, half a world away in frozen Moscow, had watched his own line falter for the same reason. Tsar Alexei Mikhailovich had 2 sons destined for the throne. Both were disabled, both ruled, after a fashion, and both stand as reminders that in royal bloodlines, power doesn't always arrive with strength. Sometimes it arrives already trembling. 19. Tsar Alexei Mikhailovich and Fyodor III. In the age of towering Orthodox cathedrals and frosted palaces, where Russian tsars ruled as intermediaries between God and a land too vast for its own good, there reigned a boy whose body refused to carry the weight of his title. His name was Fyodor III, and he was the eldest surviving son of Tsar Alexei Mikhailovich, a ruler remembered for his reforms, religious piety, and for presiding over a Russia perched at the edge of modernity. But for all the Tsar's strength and religious authority, nothing in his divine mandate could change the fact that his heir was born into a body already unraveling. Fyodor was born in 1661, the product of 2 dynasties, Romanov blood on his father's side and the powerful Miloslavsky clan on his mother's. From the beginning, he was a contradiction, a child destined to inherit an empire of orthodox rituals and military expansion, and yet one whose physical fragility would make even the most basic tasks difficult. Historical records from the time, though limited in medical precision, describe Fyodor as sickly, weak-limbed, and severely disfigured. By modern interpretation, he likely suffered from a congenital illness, possibly scrofula, a tubercular infection that swells the lymph nodes, or another chronic bone or glandular condition. His face was asymmetrical, his spine bent, he had trouble walking, struggled with pain, and reportedly endured long bouts of immobility throughout his childhood. And yet, he read. He absorbed the Greek and Latin texts that drifted into Moscow with visiting diplomats and theologians. He wrote poetry. He composed church hymns. He developed a deep interest in theology and law, and unlike many royal children, he wasn't merely indulged with education, he mastered it. Behind the closed doors of his chamber, a mind far more capable than his body was quietly forming its own idea of Russia. But a clever mind in a weak body wasn't enough to silence a court raised on strength. Fyodor's father, Tsar Alexei, was a towering figure in every sense. His reign had seen the centralization of power, wars against Poland and Sweden, and the expansion of the Romanov bureaucracy. His rule also oversaw the schism of the Russian Orthodox Church, a brutal, bloody, and theologically rigid attempt to enforce ritual uniformity. The empire was hardening, and its next Tsar, by all appearances, could barely stand upright. When Tsar Alexei died in 1676, Fyodor was just 15, and yet, despite his physical condition, there was no serious challenge to his succession. The Romanovs, still consolidating their dynasty, needed continuity more than perfection. Fyodor III was crowned Tsar of Russia, lifted into power by the same noble factions who doubted his strength but needed his bloodline. Surprisingly, Fyodor did not rule like a puppet. In fact, he ruled like a man racing against the clock. He dismissed long-serving boyars who had grown lazy under his father's protection. He reformed the court's dress and customs, pushing back against the old Muscovite severity. He promoted meritocracy in government, particularly in military appointments, favoring skill over blood. He also sought to modernize education for the nobility, planting the earliest seeds of the intellectual reforms that Peter the Great would later harvest. Fyodor was, in his short reign, a reformer, not a radical, but a reformer who understood the machinery of the state and wanted to tune it toward progress. He had no illusions about his limitations, but he also had no interest in being a placeholder, and yet his body would not keep up. By age 20, his condition worsened. His physical decline accelerated. Contemporary accounts describe a young man growing thinner, weaker, unable to leave his chambers for days at a time. He continued to rule, dictating from his bed when necessary. But in April 1682, just shy of his 21st birthday, Fyodor died, childless, exhausted, and barely remembered by the very state he tried to improve. In modern historical narratives, Fyodor III is often a footnote between two giants, his stern, God-fearing father and his half-brother Peter the Great, who would go on to drag Russia into the modern era by force. But Fyodor deserves more than a line in a textbook. He was the rare monarch whose body was frail but whose mind moved like fire. A boy who ruled not by strength but by urgency. And when he died, Russia was left with a problem. The line of succession was no longer straightforward, because the next heir, his younger brother Ivan, was, in the eyes of the court, even less fit. Even the fifth would one day be crowned, yes, but only alongside someone else, a child, a co-tsar, a placeholder, and a threat. And so the Romanovs did something no empire had done before. They put two crowns on one throne, and behind them placed a woman behind a curtain to rule them both. 20. Tsar Alexei Mikhailovich and Ivan Fy. After the death of Fyodor III, the Russian throne became a seat no one seemed eager to occupy, not because the crown had lost its luster, but because what came with it had begun to feel more like a burden than a birthright. The Romanov dynasty had successfully wrapped itself in ritual, grandeur, and claims of divine succession. But now, with Fyodor gone and no heir from his line, the fragile mathematics of inheritance came crashing down into politics, suspicion, and an uncomfortable truth. The next in line was not capable of ruling alone. That heir was Ivan V, the second surviving son of Tsar Alexei Mikhailovich and Maria Miloslavskaya. Ivan had always been different. From childhood, the royal court understood that he was not as healthy as his siblings, not as quick to speak, not as responsive to lessons, not as physically present in the way a royal child was expected to be. Foreign ambassadors and domestic officials wrote carefully coded dispatches describing him as weak of body and mind, fragile, incapable of independent leadership. His eyesight was extremely poor, likely legally blind, and he suffered from significant physical ailments that made even ceremonial appearances difficult. Later, as an adult, he would be described by observers as slow, often confused, and frequently dependent on his caretakers for basic tasks. And yet, he was still a Tsar's son, older than Peter, and in the rigid hierarchy of succession, that counted for more than aptitude. Following Fyodor's death in 1682, the court split into two bitter factions: the Miloslavsky family, Ivan's maternal relatives, who insisted on his rightful place as Tsar, and the Narishkin family, maternal kin of young Peter, Alexei's son from his second marriage. The court favored Peter, energetic and promising even at the age of 10. But the Miloslavskys had power, and they had a secret weapon: Sofia Alexeyevna, Ivan and Fyodor's sister. Sofia moved quickly. She rallied the Streltsy, the elite palace guard, and used a combination of street rumor, political maneuvering, and barely veiled threats to tilt the balance in Ivan's favor. Her proposal was a compromise, an unprecedented one: make both Ivan and Peter co-tsars. The court agreed, reluctantly. On July 25, 1682, a double coronation was held in the Dormir Cathedral in the Kremlin. A special two-seated throne was constructed, an object both practical and deeply symbolic. Ivan sat on the left, Peter on the right, and behind them, hidden by a screen but holding the reins, sat Sofia, the de facto regent. Ivan's role in government from that day forward was largely ceremonial. His disabilities prevented him from leading armies, writing laws, or commanding councils. He appeared at processions, signed edicts drafted by others, and lent his presence to formal functions. But the court, the foreign envoys, and the people of Moscow understood the state was run by Sofia and eventually by Peter. Still, Ivan was not resented, nor was he overthrown. He lived quietly, respectfully, and within his means as a co-ruler. He fathered several children and reportedly showed affection and devotion to his family. Those closest to him described a man who was kind, devout, and harmless. His reign, as unusual as it was, became something of a placeholder, a way to honor succession without letting it get in the way. Ivan V died in 1696 at the age of 29. With his death, Peter became sole ruler of Russia. The double throne was disassembled. The illusion of equal power was quietly archived, as though the whole arrangement had been a temporary detour in the royal narrative. But Ivan's presence on that throne, however silent, forced Russia to acknowledge something it had rarely admitted. Sometimes the right to rule and the ability to rule don't arrive in the same person. And that same tension echoed centuries earlier in the Spanish court, where a queen once watched her daughter descend into a fog of obsession, loss, and delusion, while still wearing a crown. A daughter too powerful to remove, too unstable to lead. History would call her Juana la Loca, but her real name was Joanna of Castile. 21. Isabella I of Castile and Joanna of Castile. Isabella I of Castile is remembered as a titan of European history, resolute, politically ferocious, and devout to a fault. She unified Spain with her husband Ferdinand, financed the voyages of Columbus, and presided over a realm that was increasingly intolerant of difference in both faith and ideology. But her personal legacy is less tidy. Behind the image of a queen who shaped an empire stands a daughter whose mind slowly slipped into disrepair, publicly, legally, and at times imperially. Joanna of Castile, Isabella's third child and second daughter, was never meant to rule. She had older siblings, and Spain, like many monarchies, still preferred male heirs, but life, or rather death, had other plans. Her brother Juan died young, her older sister Isabella predeceased their mother, her nephew Miguel, a promising heir, also died in infancy. One by one, the path to the throne cleared, and at the end of that path stood Joanna. She was highly educated, fluent in Latin, and raised in the thick atmosphere of Spanish piety and Habsburg strategy. As a teenager, she was married off to Philip the Handsome of Burgundy, a match designed to consolidate power between Spain and the rising Habsburg Empire. At first, the marriage seemed successful. Joanna became infatuated with her husband, intensely so. But the more emotionally attached she became, the more unmoored she appeared. Philip, handsome but politically calculating, grew cold. He took mistresses openly. He mocked her possessiveness. Joanna's reaction was volatile. She lashed out, wept, refused to eat, made scenes at court. Historians now believe she may have suffered from bipolar disorder or schizoaffective illness, but at the time she was labelled simply mad. Her behaviour became increasingly erratic after Philip's sudden death in 1506. Joanna refused to part with his body. She kept his casket near her. She ordered it to be opened so she could look at him. For months she travelled with the corpse across Castile, sleeping near it, refusing burial. Whether this was profound grief or something deeper, darker, or more neurological, no one could say for certain. But it made her enemies bold, and her family nervous. Her father, Ferdinand of Aragon, had no intention of letting his unstable daughter rule. He declared her unfit and named himself regent. Later, her son Charles, future Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, would do the same. Joanna was confined to Tordesillas, a convent-like palace where she lived for nearly 5 decades. She was never formally deposed, but she never held true power again. For 50 years she remained queen in name, prisoner in fact. Courtiers visited her under strict rules. Her children came and went, her attendants aged around her, and still she signed papers, gave royal consent, held audiences. She was not comatose or catatonic, just inconsistent. Lucid one day, unreachable the next. Joanna died in 1555. Her tomb rests beside her husband's, a final reunion that once would have thrilled her and later haunted her. History would reduce her name to madness, but the more unsettling truth is that she remained just lucid enough to stay on the books, too unstable to rule, too royal to remove. And in the Habsburg court, that delicate fiction of sacred blood over visible reality would return again and again. Most tragically in the form of a boy born centuries later, a child so incapacitated by seizures and developmental delays that even coronation robes couldn't cover the cracks. His name was Ferdinand I of Austria, and he would rule only because no one else could. 22. Emperor Francis II/Wayne of Austria and Ferdinand I, Emperor of Austria. By the time Ferdinand I of Austria was born in 1793, the Habsburg dynasty was already deep into its centuries-long genetic gamble. Royal blood, kept royal by repeated marriages within the same family lines, had become a kind of delicate glass, sparkling in public, but perilously prone to fracture behind palace walls. Ferdinand was born with the crest, the name, the bloodline, and the titles. But what he lacked, conspicuously and increasingly, was the capacity to rule. His father, Francis II, had the unique distinction of being both the last Holy Roman Emperor and the first Emperor of Austria, titles he held consecutively as the Napoleonic world rearranged itself. Francis was a man of rules and survival. His reign was spent trying to outmaneuver the chaos of the French Revolution and the rising tides of nationalism. He wasn't warm. He wasn't modern, but he was careful, and in dynastic terms, that was enough. So when his son was born with unmistakable signs of congenital illness, the Habsburg court's first instinct was not to publicize or diagnose. It was to manage. Ferdinand was afflicted from infancy with a suite of conditions, most notably epilepsy, which made his health unpredictable and, at times, alarming to those around him. He experienced frequent and severe seizures. His speech was affected. His motor skills were poor. His head was unusually shaped, possibly due to hydrocephalus or related conditions. He limped. He struggled to write. He could understand, but often not articulate. He was tutored, but learning was slow and uneven. The court doctors described him in whispers, often in Latin, so the servants wouldn't overhear. But in the brutal accounting of hereditary monarchy, ability was secondary to birth order. Ferdinand was named crown prince and formally educated in politics, languages, and courtly protocol. In theory, this was preparation for rule. In practice, it was a long exercise in formal denial. Everyone knew Ferdinand would never govern without assistance. But to name a different heir, to acknowledge his incapacity outright, was to admit that royal blood was not divine, just biological. And biology, in the Habsburg dynasty, had already begun to betray them. When Francis I died in 1835, Ferdinand became Emperor of Austria, King of Hungary, and King of Bohemia. His coronation was as lavish as any before him, complete with robes, oaths, music, and a heavy crown placed on a head that trembled under its weight. The empire put on the show, but no one mistook it for governance. Real power moved to a secret council, the Geheime Staatskonferenz, made up of Ferdinand's uncle Archduke Ludwig, Chancellor Prince Metternich, and other conservative figures of the old order. Ferdinand attended meetings, but rarely contributed. He signed laws that had been written for him. He was said to repeat phrases out of context. His seizures, while hidden from the public, were known and feared by his handlers. He was a constitutional monarch in name only, though the constitution wouldn't come until the revolution forced it. And then came 1848. Europe ignited in rebellion. France, Italy, Germany, Hungary, all roaring against monarchy, against autocracy, against the old world. In Vienna, the cries of revolutionaries echoed through the palace gates. Protesters demanded reform, accountability, and leadership. Ferdinand, ill and overwhelmed, reportedly looked at his ministers and asked, "But must I govern too?" The answer was no. He abdicated that same year, peacefully, without protest, without ceremony. He handed the crown to his young nephew, Franz Joseph I, who would rule for nearly 70 years and spend much of that time trying to unspool the empire Ferdinand never quite ruled at all. Ferdinand lived on in retirement for decades. He gardened, he played music, he grew melons at his summer residence and reportedly enjoyed showing them to guests with great enthusiasm. He died in 1875, having long outlived both his reign and his reputation. He was remembered by those closest to him as kind, gentle, and awkwardly lovable. He was remembered by the state as a necessary embarrassment. His reign was officially acknowledged but never truly studied, because it didn't fit the imperial narrative. The empire had chosen to crown a man who could not lead, and in doing so, it told on itself. And Ferdinand wasn't the only child of Francis I to be quietly removed from the spotlight. His sister, born with even more visible impairments, was sent down a different path entirely, not into rule, but into permanent care. Her name was Marie Anne, and her story would be one of elegant disappearance. 23rd, Emperor Francis II, First of Austria and Archduchess Marie Anne. There is a long-standing tradition in European monarchies. When a royal child does not fit the mold, you don't rewrite the mold, you rewrite the child's story, and sometimes you erase it altogether. That's what happened to Archduchess Marie Anne, the daughter of Emperor Francis II and Empress Maria Theresa of Naples and Sicily. Born into the most powerful family of the Habsburg dynasty, Marie Anne arrived with all the expectations of her rank and none of the ability to fulfill them. She was born in 1804 during the turbulent Napoleonic years when Francis was juggling two imperial identities, first as the last Holy Roman Emperor and then as the first Emperor of Austria. While her father faced political reconfiguration on the grandest scale, Marianne's life was shaped by something far more intimate, a body and mind that diverged from what the court required. Marie Anne was the 10th child in a brood of over a dozen. She was born with severe physical and intellectual disabilities, the exact nature of which remain vague, but the historical record leaves few doubts. Her head was described as disproportionate, and she showed significant delays in motor skills and language acquisition. As she grew, it became evident she would not speak fluently, could not be educated in the traditional sense, and would never be able to participate in the public duties or dynastic marriages that defined her siblings' lives. In the polished and ceremonial world of the Habsburg court, this posed a problem. Royal children were born into scripts. Some would marry for politics, others enter the clergy, and a few become statesmen or generals. Marianne didn't fit any of these roles, so the court, rather than adjusting the expectations, quietly disappeared her from the main stage. She was relocated to the Hetzendorf Palace, a former imperial residence just outside Vienna. There, under round-the-clock care, she lived a life that was both sheltered and strangely static. The palace was comfortable, her attendants loyal, and her needs met, but the life itself was not truly her own. It was curated like an unfinished portrait stored in a gilded frame room, never meant to be displayed. She lived there for over 50 years. Few paintings exist of her, and almost no contemporary letters discuss her at length. She made no appearances at court functions. Unlike her brother Ferdinand, whose disabilities had to be publicly navigated due to his position as emperor, Marianne was quietly filed away into history's attic, where inconvenient royalty was stored out of sight. She died in 1858 at age 54, largely unknown to the public that worshipped her family's image. Her grave, marked modestly in the imperial crypt, lies alongside Austria's greatest rulers. But her story was left out of the dynastic myth, not because she was unloved, but because she didn't work in the political machinery, in the visual narrative, in the orderly structure of power and presentation. And in this silence, the Habsburgs revealed their truest instinct, not cruelty but erasure, better to be forgotten than to be explained. But one generation earlier, another Habsburg woman, also disabled, but with a sharper mind and an even sharper sense of irony, refused to be erased. Her name was Archduchess Maria Anna, and she lived in the very palace where her niece would later be sequestered. 24. Empress Maria Theresa and Archduchess Maria Anna. To be the daughter of Empress Maria Theresa was to be born into the eye of an empire. The Empress was a reformer, a stateswoman, and the only woman to rule the Habsburg dominions in her own right. Her children were in many ways human chess pieces. Some were queens, others were clerics, and all of them were born into a world that valued utility over sentiment. Maria Anna, born in 1738, was her second child and her first daughter. At first, the birth was celebrated. A female heir could be married into Europe's great houses, and Maria Theresa understood the value of diplomacy through marriage. But from early infancy, it became clear that Maria Anna's future would not follow the typical arc of a Habsburg princess. She was born with a serious spinal deformity, likely a form of scoliosis or kyphosis that worsened as she grew. Compounding this were chronic lung problems, which made breathing difficult and standing for long periods impossible. She had the mind of a scholar, but the body of someone who struggled with the basic rituals of court life. Her education, however, was never compromised. If anything, it was amplified. Denied a stage in public, she found power in private. Maria Anna became a voracious reader. She studied theology, philosophy, history, and languages. She corresponded with leading intellectuals. Her journals, preserved in fragments, suggest a woman of keen insight and wry humor, one who understood not only the structure of the court, but its deep absurdity. She also had a religious streak, though not a simplistic one. She saw the church not as a retreat, but as a space where women like her could still matter. Unlike other disabled royals of the time, Maria Anna was never forcibly hidden. She remained visible, if marginal. She attended certain family functions, hosted visitors in private salons, and became a quiet confidant to her younger siblings. Her mother, while never overly sentimental, seems to have had genuine affection for her. There was even some discussion, though brief, of naming her abbess of a royal convent, a kind of semi-autonomous leadership role for high-born women. But ultimately, Maria Anna stayed within the imperial fold, a permanent resident of the palatial margins. She died in 1789, just months before the French Revolution would begin tearing down the aristocratic order she'd been born to uphold. In some ways, her life foreshadowed that collapse. She was royalty, but without function, a daughter of power who could observe but never exercise it. Maria Anna, like her niece Marianne decades later, didn't challenge the monarchy. She revealed its limitations. And unlike the forgotten Archduchess in Hetzendorf, Maria Anna left behind traces, words, letters, reflections, enough to remind us that not all silences are empty, and not all impairments were sequestered in palace wings. Some ended up in the most public place of all, the throne. Each such case came with King Philip V of Spain, whose son Ferdinand VI was crowned with all the proper ceremony, and then mentally unravelled in front of an entire court that couldn't admit what was happening, even as the king himself disappeared. Not in exile, not in death, but in plain sight. 25. King Philip V of Spain and Ferdinand VI. When Ferdinand VI was crowned King of Spain in 1746, there was a rare tentative optimism in the air. His father, Philip V, had ruled erratically, punctuated by long periods of reclusion, religious fervour, and impulsive decision-making. So when Ferdinand took the throne, he was seen as a quiet alternative, measured, calm, apolitical. In other words, a breather. For a while he fulfilled that promise. His early reign was defined by moderation. He kept Spain out of unnecessary wars, encouraged infrastructure reforms, and invested in music and architecture. He was deeply devoted to his wife, Barbara of Portugal, who became his closest advisor and emotional anchor. But this dependence on her proved dangerous, because when she died in 1758, Ferdinand began to mentally and physically decline with alarming speed. At first, the court thought it was grief, understandable. Then they thought it was depression, then something deeper. Ministers reported he was refusing to meet with advisors. He stopped signing documents. He withdrew from public view entirely. His eating habits changed. His speech grew fragmented. Soon, he was essentially incommunicado, a monarch in name only. For nearly a full year, Spain existed in a bizarre state, officially governed by a king who no longer participated in governance. It became known informally as El Año Sin Rey, the year without a king. No abdication was declared. No regent was appointed. Instead, the court simply waited. Ferdinand died in 1759, having produced no heirs. His half-brother, Charles III, was called in from Naples to take the throne and pick up the pieces of a monarchy that had spent a year pretending everything was fine. Ferdinand VI's story is usually told as a postscript, less dramatic than others, less tragic than some. But what it reveals is chilling. Even in the Enlightenment age, with rising science and secular governance, monarchies still had no framework for confronting incapacity. They still defaulted to ritual, denial, and silence. And that silence wasn't exclusive to Spain. Over in Russia, one of the most terrifying monarchs in history, Ivan the Terrible, had a son whose mind was so clouded that he couldn't rule at all. And yet, rule he did, or at least he appeared to. His name was Fyodor I, and his reign would quietly collapse the dynasty that built him. 26. Tsar Ivan IV the Terrible and Fyodor I. In a country that revered fire and feared silence, Fyodor I of Russia was a strange kind of monarch. He didn't shout, he didn't scheme, he didn't kill. He prayed, he rang bells, he wandered corridors, and all around him Russia held its breath, waiting for a ruler to rise where a shadow now stood. Fyodor was the son of Ivan IV, known to history as Ivan the Terrible. Ivan had built an empire on blood, fear, and the bones of his enemies. His rule was legendary for its violence and theatrical grandeur, but his line, the vaunted Rurikids, was wearing thin. His eldest son, the capable Ivan Ivanovich, died young, allegedly at his father's hand, during a fit of rage. That left Fyodor quiet and gentle, with none of his father's fire and all of his family's weight. Born in 1557, Fyodor had always been different. He was passive, reclusive, and given to long stretches of religious contemplation. He didn't speak much. He didn't engage in court intrigue. He wasn't cruel, clever, or ambitious, traits the Russian boyar class had come to expect in their czars. Modern historians suggest he may have had an intellectual disability, compounded by years of emotional neglect and trauma under his father's shadow. But in the late 16th century, Russia didn't use clinical terms. They simply called him pious, and left it at that. When Ivan IV died in 1584, Fyodor inherited the throne. He was 27, married to the strong-willed Irina Godunova, and wholly unprepared to rule. Fortunately, or perhaps inevitably, the real power shifted quickly to his brother-in-law Boris Godunov, who became the de facto ruler behind the throne. Fyodor signed edicts, attended ceremonies, and went through the motions of governance. But it was Boris who made the decisions. Fyodor's reign, from a distance, looked peaceful. There were no great purges or wars. The state functioned, but underneath the surface there was a deepening crisis. Fyodor and Irina had no children. The line of succession was about to end, and everyone knew it. When Fyodor died in 1598, it wasn't just the end of a reign, it was the end of the Rurik dynasty, which had ruled Russia for over 700 years. His death triggered the time of troubles, a prolonged period of famine, civil unrest, foreign intervention, and dynastic chaos. Pretenders to the throne appeared and vanished. Boyars jockeyed for influence, and the Russian people, long used to autocracy, found themselves without a center. Fyodor wasn't hated, he wasn't blamed, he was simply remembered, if remembered at all, as the Tsar who wasn't built for the throne he inherited, a ruler who never really ruled, a name in the lineage, and not much else. His story shows what happens when a monarchy refuses to admit the obvious, that a crown without capacity is just a ceremonial weight. And if Russia's story reads like a long, slow unraveling, France had its own version, quieter, more intimate, but no less revealing. Because even a king who could command armies and build palaces could still struggle with something as basic as his own voice. 27. King Henry IV of France and Louis XIII. The son of King Henry IV of France, Louis XIII was born into a legacy of tension and repair. His father had converted from Protestantism to Catholicism to secure the throne, issuing the Edict of Nantes to end religious war, only to be assassinated by a religious zealot. When Louis became king in 1610, he was 9 years old, fatherless, and already marked by something the court could not ignore, a persistent stutter. In an age when kings were expected to command not just armies but language, this was a visible flaw. Louis XIII struggled to speak in public. He stammered during speeches. He often paused, searched for words, and repeated syllables. The court took notice. So did foreign ambassadors. In a world of orators, he sounded like a broken instrument. His stutter wasn't just inconvenient, it was political. Every hesitation was interpreted as weakness. Every pause was cause for speculation. Was he unsure, indecisive, afraid? And worse, was it hereditary? The Bourbon dynasty, barely secure after decades of religious conflict, couldn't afford to look vulnerable. To compensate, Louis XIII was trained aggressively. Tutors drilled him. Court etiquette was rehearsed obsessively. He learned to speak slowly, formally, and with great restraint. He became a master of withholding, which in time became his entire ruling style. He said little, he expressed less, and in that silence, people projected whatever they wanted: strength, wisdom, mystery, instability. Despite his speech challenges, Louis XIII matured into a competent, though emotionally distant monarch. He relied heavily on advisors, most famously Cardinal Richelieu, who became the architect of centralized French power and religious uniformity. Together, they laid the groundwork for the absolutism that would define Louis XIV's reign. But privately, Louis XIII remained an enigma. Socially withdrawn, prone to long silences and emotionally stiff, he rarely showed affection, even to his wife Anne of Austria. He fathered children late, and his ability to express himself remained limited throughout his life. His stutter never left him. It simply became part of the decor. He died in 1643, leaving behind a 4-year-old heir and a state held together by bureaucracy and silence. History remembers him as a transitional figure, neither great nor terrible, just careful. But underneath that image was a man who spent his entire life fighting his own voice. And it's a reminder that not all royal disabilities were visible from the outside. Some were tucked inside every sentence, every pause, every unspoken word. But sometimes the condition was far more visible and far more dangerous. Across Europe, in a kingdom split between Bohemia and Hungary, another young royal was struggling with something far more disruptive: epilepsy. And while his reign was short, the rumors that followed him would last much longer. 28. King Vladislaus II and Louis II of Hungary. The late 15th and early 16th centuries were not kind to the Kingdom of Hungary. Politically cornered between the rising Ottoman Empire and a restless Habsburg dynasty, Hungary needed a warrior king, a strategist, a statesman. What it got was Louis II, a boy thrust onto the throne at the age of 10 and likely suffering from epileptic seizures that left his court both alarmed and uncertain. His father, King Vladislaus II, had been a compromise king, elected more for his passivity than his strength. The Hungarian nobility found him agreeable precisely because he wasn't aggressive. The problem was this temperament passed down to his son, and with it something more complicated. Louis II was crowned in 1516, still a child, his reign propped up by regents and ministers. But even from an early age, observers noted that something wasn't quite right. He had difficulty maintaining focus. He experienced unexplained fainting spells. He sometimes fell mid-sentence or froze during formal events. While no definitive diagnosis exists, modern historians suspect epilepsy, or at least some form of neurological disorder, which may have worsened under the strain of kingship. The Hungarian court, already fractured, didn't know what to make of this. Was it divine punishment, an omen, or simply weakness? In a kingdom constantly under threat from Ottoman expansion, there was no room for hesitation. And Louis, tragically, grew up surrounded by people who either minimized his condition or ignored it altogether. By the time he was 20, Louis II was officially the King of Hungary and Bohemia. But the reality was far grimmer. The kingdom was bankrupt, the army undermanned, and the Ottomans advancing. In 1526, Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent marched toward Hungary with a vast force. Louis, now a young man, decided, or was forced, to lead the defense himself. The result was the Battle of Mohacs, a catastrophe that ended with Louis's death and the near-total collapse of Hungary's independence. According to one popular account, he drowned while fleeing the battlefield, thrown from his horse into a river in his heavy armor. Others suggest he suffered a seizure during the chaos. Either way, he died without air, and his body was found days later. Louis II's reign was short, tragic, and marked by inability, not of character perhaps, but of body. He was born into a role that demanded clarity, vigor, and strength. What he offered instead was vulnerability, and the system around him had no way to accommodate it. And that same system would repeat its pattern elsewhere. In another royal household, this time in Safavid Iran, a ruler would face a similar dilemma. But rather than navigate his children's disabilities, he would inflict them, not by accident, not by illness, but as policy. 29. Don Carlos, Prince of Asturias, extended Habsburg inclusion via Philip II of Spain. In the long corridors of the Spanish court, under Philip II, everything was lacquered, calculated, and catastrophically rigid. His empire stretched across continents, his palaces echoed with Latin prayers and whispered alliances. But in one gilded chamber, a child was growing up wrong. Don Carlos, his son by his first wife, was meant to be the future of Spain. Instead, he became its most infamous hidden wound. Don Carlos was born in 1545, the product of a marriage between first cousins, a not uncommon Habsburg arrangement. The bloodline was royal, yes, but increasingly unstable. His birth was troubled, his body was frail, his skull was misshapen, one leg shorter than the other, and he walked with a limp. He suffered from poor eyesight and frequent fevers. But it wasn't his body that concerned the court, it was his mind. From childhood, Carlos was erratic. He was prone to fits of rage and dark moods, and he injured animals and staff, showing bursts of violence that unnerved even hardened courtiers. Some historians believe he may have suffered from a neurodevelopmental condition or a severe psychiatric disorder, but the vocabulary of the 16th century did not allow for clinical diagnosis. At the time, he was simply called unstable. His tutors struggled, he fell behind in his studies, he lashed out when corrected, and still he was heir to the most powerful monarchy in Europe. As Carlos reached adolescence, things grew worse. He accused courtiers of spying. He believed his father wanted him dead. He began to physically assault nobles. At one point, he reportedly tried to throw a servant down a staircase. At another, he fell down the stairs himself and sustained a head injury that further deteriorated his condition. The line between what was real and what was court gossip became increasingly thin, but even the most conservative historians agree Don Carlos was unfit to rule, yet he had to rule. At least that was the plan. His father, Philip II, was a man of immense discipline. He had patience for war, theology, and court administration. But with his son, his tolerance began to collapse. Carlos's public behavior became dangerous. Rumors swirled that he was plotting against his father, forming secret alliances with enemies of the crown. In 1568, Philip took a drastic step. He ordered the arrest of his own son. Don Carlos was imprisoned in a series of luxurious but isolated chambers. Food was restricted, visitors denied. The prince's health declined. After 6 months in custody, he died. Official reports blamed illness. Others whispered starvation, or worse. No public explanation was ever fully offered. Philip went on ruling, unchallenged. Don Carlos was buried with honors, his name smoothed into dynastic footnotes. And the Spanish court learned what so many monarchies eventually learn, that when the air is broken, the system will break around them. Rather than for them, his story passed into myth, into opera, into whispered lore. But the pattern remained. and it would echo again in courts far from Iberia, where royal blood didn't just wither from within, but was violently repressed from above. 30. Sultan Abbas I of Safavid Iran and his blinded sons. In the late 16th and early 17th centuries, Safavid Iran was undergoing transformation. Under Shah Abbas I, the empire became a powerhouse of art, architecture, trade, and centralized power. He moved the capital to Isfahan, turned caravanserais into lifelines, and lined streets with fountains. But while the empire blossomed, Abbas's own bloodline was undergoing a quiet, brutal extinction, because Shah Abbas, for all his modern reforms, was haunted by dynastic paranoia. And nothing triggered that paranoia more than his own sons. He had several sons, accounts vary slightly, but two in particular stand out: Muhammad Bakr Mirza, often seen as the most capable, and Imam Koli Mirza. Bakr was popular among the court, charismatic, and showed promise as a military leader. Too much promise, in fact. Whispers began. Was he plotting? Was he gaining too much influence? Abbas's court had long been wary of succession disputes. The Safavid dynasty was relatively young, and Abbas had seized power after removing his own father from the throne. He had no desire to be replaced the same way, and so, in a decision that would stun even his most loyal advisors, Shah Abbas had Bakr executed, a son removed not for failure but for success. Other sons met different fates. Some were blinded, a practice intended to ensure they could never legally or culturally claim the throne. In Persian and broader Islamic royal traditions, blinding a prince was equivalent to rendering him politically dead. It was not uncommon in the medieval Islamic world, but Abbas applied it with particular zeal. One such case was Muhammad Bakr's younger brother, Safi Mirza, who may have been spared execution by feigning incompetence or simply by being less threatening. But like many of Abbas's sons, he was permanently disabled, blinded, to prevent any challenge to the throne. The irony is staggering. Abbas had no legitimate heir by the end of his reign. He had created an empire of roads, gardens, and trade routes, only to find himself alone at the summit. When he died in 1629, the only son he hadn't killed or mutilated was Safi I, who would go on to rule, but only after years of political damage control. Blinding, in this context, was not punishment, it was policy, a tool of dynastic containment. Abbas wasn't reacting to disability, he was producing it, and the consequences were long-lasting. The Safavid line grew increasingly erratic and vulnerable. Later rulers would face challenges from within and without, and the memory of Abbas's decision hung over the throne like a curse. And yet even that wasn't the end of the pattern. Because once a king learns he can control succession through mutilation or removal, the precedent is hard to resist. His grandson, Shah Safi, would pick up where Abbas left off. 31. Shah Safi of Safavid Iran and the blinded prince's power, once it becomes about survival, rarely knows when to stop. Shah Safi, the grandson of Abbas I, inherited not only an empire but a blueprint. His grandfather had killed or blinded his brothers. Now it was Safi's turn to ensure no one stood behind him with a better claim. Safi came to the throne in 1629, young, impulsive, and already steeped in a court culture that equated loyalty with obedience, and obedience with incapacity. It didn't take long before he began to follow Abbas's strategy: disfigure the line of succession before it becomes a threat. In the first years of his reign, Safi ordered the blinding of several male relatives, including a child named Muhammad Mirza, a boy who, in some accounts, faked blindness to survive. Whether he was spared or not remains unclear, but the symbolism could not have been more grotesque. To safeguard the throne, Safi didn't wait for ambition to arise. He preemptively disabled those who might one day imagine it. It was monarchy by amputation. Blinding wasn't symbolic, it was strategic. A prince who could not see could not rule, at least not in the eyes of Safavid tradition. And so, Safi continued the work Abbas had started. He narrowed the dynasty down to a line of one, repeatedly burning the family tree to avoid branches. The consequences were immediate. Safi was paranoid, isolated, and increasingly cruel. He ruled through fear, surrounded by eunuchs, informants, and loyalists. The royal court grew anxious, quieter. Ministers plotted, the populace grumbled, and the dynasty, while still rich and visually magnificent, had lost its depth. It became a house of mirrors, where every reflection was watching for treason. Shah Safi's reign ended with his death in 1642, and the throne passed to Abbas II, one of the few remaining male heirs not blinded or dead. But by then, the royal line was shallow, the trust between crown and family severed. Abbas II would try to rebuild, but the legacy of calculated disability haunted the palace halls. This was not disability as misfortune. It was weaponized weakness, manufactured to secure a crown, only to leave the monarchy itself permanently fragile. And far from Persia, on the Korean peninsula, another king would make a different but equally consequential decision when faced with a troubled son. He wouldn't blind him. He wouldn't kill him, not directly. He would do something slower, more symbolic. He would put him in a box. 32. King Yongjo of Joseon, Korea, and Crown Prince Sado. It's one of the most chilling images in Korean royal history. A wooden rice chest in the summer heat, sealed tight under a sweltering palace roof, and inside it, not grain, not treasure, but a prince. A royal heir who had once ridden through the capital in triumph, now gasping for air in a box smaller than his birthright. But this was not an execution, not exactly. This was discipline, as the royal court of Joseon, Korea defined it. The man who ordered it, King Yongjo, was a ruler known for austerity, Confucian reform, and a relentless sense of duty. He ruled for 52 years, navigating political factionalism, palace intrigue, and social unrest. He was careful, precise, and at times cold, but he was not reckless. Everything he did was deliberate, including what happened to his son, Crown Prince Sado. Sado's story is a difficult one, not just because it ended in a chest, but because it began with such contradiction. Born in 1735, he was bright, charming, and artistically inclined. But from an early age, Sado clashed with his father's strict and traditional expectations. Yongjo, who had clawed his way to the throne through bitter court politics, viewed softness as weakness. Sado's emotional volatility, mood swings, and erratic behavior didn't just worry him, they terrified him. Modern scholars have speculated that Sado may have had a severe mental illness, perhaps bipolar disorder or another neuropsychiatric condition. His behavior reportedly grew more unpredictable in adolescence. Periods of charm gave way to violent outbursts, then to deep depressions. Some accounts describe him displaying paranoia, irrational fears, and disturbing conduct, especially within the inner quarters of the palace. But the key detail here is not diagnosis, it's isolation. The Joseon court, steeped in Confucian hierarchy, had no space for emotional ambiguity. A crown prince could not be unstable. He was either virtuous or criminal, loyal or treasonous, filial or deviant. Sado fell into none of these categories neatly, which made him dangerous. By the time he reached adulthood, factions at court were whispering, could he really inherit the throne? Was he safe? And more quietly, was he sane? King Yongjo, torn between paternal duty and national preservation, made a decision. He could not execute his own son outright. It would violate Confucian values and threaten the legitimacy of the line. So instead, he sealed him inside a wooden rice chest left out under the palace eaves in midsummer. After several days, the prince died. The court explained it away. Official records cited filial disobedience and breaches of protocol, but no one forgot. The event became a national trauma, a symbol of the clash between duty and humanity, ritual and mercy. Crown Prince Sado's son, King Jongjo, would go on to become one of Korea's most respected reformers, but even he could not erase the weight of the box or the father who ordered it. Yet for all the violence and tragedy, the story of Sado raises a strange question. What would have happened if his mind had simply failed him in old age, quietly, like so many monarchs before him? Would the chest have been replaced with a shadow council? Would silence have stood in for punishment? Because sometimes disability wasn't punished, it was simply endured. And in 19th century Bavaria, one such story played out under the guise of nobility, exile, and the tragedy of a king misplaced by temperament. 33. King Ludwig I of Bavaria and Otto of Greece. When King Ludwig I of Bavaria agreed to send his son to become king of newly independent Greece, it was more of a European compromise than a proud dynastic gift. Greece had been freed from Ottoman rule in the 1830s, and the European powers, Britain, France and Russia, wanted a monarch, preferably one young Catholic and obedient. And Ludwig had just the boy, Otto, a teen with royal blood, no political baggage, and one inconvenient detail: he was never really suited for the job. Born in 1815, Otto was a romantic figure, raised in the refined court of Munich, steeped in art, poetry, and Bavarian conservatism. But behind the crown-polished surface was a young man who struggled with intense pressure, emotional instability, and what modern psychiatry might diagnose as recurrent depressive episodes, if not a broader mood disorder. He was 17 when he was sent to Athens in 1832, installed as King of Greece by foreign powers, more interested in stability than legitimacy. Otto didn't speak Greek. He arrived with Bavarian advisors, a foreign army, and the heavy expectation of civilizing a land that barely resembled the courts of Central Europe. It didn't go well. Otto was intelligent and idealistic, but increasingly isolated. He was indecisive, often melancholic, and deeply unprepared for the brutal realism of Greek politics. His failure to produce an heir, his unwillingness to convert to orthodoxy, and his reliance on foreign advisors only deepened public resentment. He had little local support and even less self-assurance. Over time, Otto's mental health deteriorated. Reports describe periods of withdrawal, erratic decisions, and emotional outbursts. He would go silent for days. He wept during council meetings. His letters became cryptic and self-pitying. While there was no coup, in the dramatic sense, his removal became inevitable. In 1862, after 3 decades of increasingly troubled rule, Otto was forced to abdicate. He and his wife returned to Bavaria, where he lived quietly for another 2 decades, never again holding power, never again stepping into public life with confidence. His reign in Greece was retrospectively framed as noble failure, the tragic misplacement of a prince too soft for the throne he was given. And perhaps he was. But Otto's story also reveals something deeper: how easily mental health was reframed as political weakness, how compassion was mistaken for incompetence, and how even the most civilized monarchies had no room for a king who cried in public. His father, Ludwig I, outlived the scandal, but he could not erase it, and so Otto became the last on our list, a reminder that disability in royal history came not just in the form of seizures or silence, but also in the inability to conform to a system that demanded stoicism above all. Because in monarchy, sometimes the cruelest punishment isn't exile or imprisonment. It's being told that the world you rule has no room for who you actually are.